the goals for today is the first part of what we'll cover. Hopefully before we get to lunch, we'll get through it, is building the relationship. And we're going to walk through a lot of different activities that you can do that you could use session by session if you wanted to as you're walking through with them. So it's really structured and much more structured than what I've done in the past. Just in the more supervisees that I work with, the more I've realized different things are helpful to put into place. And so that's how a lot of this came about. When we get to the second half of today is where we'll look at a lot of the paperwork pieces and things that would be good to include, a lot of new things that I've added in to try to protect us and just liability wise, and all of those logs, all of those types of things are in that second half. So on that first page that you've got, and we'll use the manual throughout today. I've just found manuals are easier for me to do than the PowerPoints, and that way you're taking it all home too. But as you look through this, and it's similar to some things that I've had in the past, but it talks about effective supervisory behaviors. Do you see a couple on there that are harder for you to accomplish than others as you've had some experience supervising, or if you even think about supervising?
I don't know if this is kind of said word for word in here, but I know for me, I like to sort of like jump in and get my hands dirty. And so for me, I think that self-control to kind of sit back and let them kind of work through what they're trying to work through, and then also kind of giving them that autonomy to kind of
be
figure it out.
Independent at the same time. So trying to provide. For me, I think a lot of it goes into a lot of what we're talking about this morning, but it goes into just helping them. You're trying for a relationship that you want to have, and it talks about having the constructive criticism, but also being encouraging and supportive. So it's part of that communicating effectively is what it's under on this one. And that's where I find, a lot of my struggles. I would say my perspective on supervision has changed drastically, like through the years from when I started out, to where it is now. And some of that I found, it was my own weaknesses, but it's also part of when you do well in the field, and so you're really doing well as a counselor, which then you're thinking, okay, I'll be a supervisor. Either whatever your motivation is, either I'm helping the next generation of counselors, or I'm going to add on to my practice because I'm full, or our agency is needing people to fill a certain role and to be able to meet with clients and to do certain things. When we do counseling, we really never do know what we're going to get. I do have personality where I am more structured outside of counseling world, I would say. But we don't have always a plan like for every session that we're going into, because a lot of it is based on, did they have a crisis that week? Or, yes, you're asking about, did they follow through on hopefully something that you gave them to work on? But they're also leading a lot of that, whether that's good or bad. And with supervision, I took that very same approach because that's what I'd known, all those years that you do with counseling. And that's what I had experienced in supervision. That's all that I had known to that point, was you do like the case consultation, which is like a client coming in with their story for the week, and you talk through that, which you can do. There's so much more that could be accomplished, and that I found that is helpful for supervisees to be able to incorporate along the way, to be able to help them get to some more growth. And with our ultimate goal being that word that we always use, which is self-supervision, that we'll talk about, and getting to that point. So the trickiest part is that we all know that the most important piece of the relationship with a client is the foundation. It doesn't matter how many times have we heard it. It doesn't matter what theory you use or what technique you use or exactly what direction you went. Another counselor may have headed one direction and you may have headed another, but usually you'll end up at the same point. If you have built that relationship and you built that rapport that you need to build. And it's really the same thing with supervision. Like, we could do that case consultation every week, and I could give resources and techniques and new ideas, but if I haven't built the relationship that I need to build with them, or I'm finding that it's difficult to do that, then that's the same experience that the clients are having. And it's taken a long time for me to get that perspective and recognize if this has, some pieces to it that are uncomfortable or a little awkward, or there's just something different about it one way or another, then it probably means the clients are experiencing the same thing. And that's the amazing thing, is if you'll pay attention in supervision to how they're talking about a story or telling about a client or expressing something that happened, they're probably showing you the emotions in front of you that they were having when they were in that session, if you're in tune enough to be paying attention to those types of things. So it's just a much bigger viewpoint than I had when I first started out of, okay, we'll talk just week by week on the people that you have and try to give some direction. And so now it has really changed, and I've seen that be a positive, because it's helping them work through still some of their stuff, as I would say, while they're interns, and they're with clients, versus like throwing that to the side and just trying to just focus on clients and pretend like it's not there. So I'll talk about some of the stories, because there are a lot of things going on right now that are really helpful. On that next page, it talks about building the supervision relationship and the counselor development that can happen. So the goals that we just talked about, the board would say, and what the government's view of our license would be, is that we're trying to ensure a client's welfare. So it's protect the public, at all costs if we can. The second one is for us to develop them as a professional, and then that last one, helps us get towards self-supervision, is the ultimate piece. So a lot of times we think of supervision being developing them as a professional. Maybe we think about protecting the public. Really, we're thinking about our license, and not wanting something to happen to us in the process. And the self-supervision, yes, we hope that people get there by the end. And sometimes I would say that happens, and sometimes maybe it hasn't happened as much. In a lot of the supervision relationships I've had, and this is a lot of discussion, like my goal, and it whether I had the perspective I needed on the relationship or not, it was still, I can see the evidence of it through the years, is that even the supervisees that maybe I didn't share some of the same values or motives or even approach or different things, not unethical, but just the way they went about things, even though some of those weren't shared, and I was very aware of that, I don't think that they always were, and they always knew that I supported them, because they've stayed in touch with me for years, even though in my mind I'm like, that was not one of my better supervisees or one of my better experiences that I had. Not because I didn't enjoy that relationship, or that I didn't believe in them, but maybe just because of the progress, or they had a lot of their own stuff they were still dealing with, or whatever it might have been. But with some of those, I didn't have these tools back then, and so I wasn't incorporating everything that I could have to help them along the way too. So the goal is for them to know that if you're being an encouragement and a support, then our hope is that they're being very honest and ethical and telling us what's going on. And in the meantime of having that relationship, then they're also gaining some tools, and they're wanting to grow themselves, So I have some supervisees I know when they come in, it's like, teach me everything I didn't learn in school. And it's just really not. I've felt that pressure before from more than one, and had to just kind of, let them know and give them a different perspective of what supervision really can be. And it could be that, but it would involve them doing a lot of that work on their own. It's not like in this 1 hour a week, like clients, and they have to do something outside of the room. It's not going to teach them everything that they didn't learn in their schooling, or from their other supervisors in school, or from whoever they have been under their practicum experiences, whatever that might have been. So those are our ultimate goals. To self-supervise, it's saying that they can monitor their own behavior, they can compare it to a model or skill, and then they can attempt to change it, like when they're recognizing that change needs to happen, or when we're bringing up, some concerns or some things that we're noticing. But it's a very fine line when you're trying to be, the encourager and the support, but you're also trying to be the constructive criticism on the other end of, here are some things that you might want to incorporate or that you could be doing. So that's self-supervision in itself. And it talks about the activities and supervision. It's during that supervision time and outside of it, but it's to help meet those goals. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to walk through what these could be one by one, and I'll explain how I've used them. What I will say, and my disclaimer up front, is that it's not structured to the point that here's what I do the exact first session, here's what I do the exact second session, and here's what the third one looks like. But what I've done is I've created them so they're in a format that based on what that supervisee needs, you could be able to draw from it and have more of a plan, as you move forward and walking through it. So the first one is the supervisee and supervisor. It's that Yoon typology, and it's an assessment. And so with the assessment, you go to humanmetrics.com. It's free to be able to go there, and they take the Yoon assessment. They probably did the Myers-Briggs at some point in school, but it's good for them to get on and to do it again and be able to see if those results match, and you can talk through that. What you do is it helps them deal with some of their stuff if they have some, or even get more insight to themselves by using these tools where you're not counseling them in supervision, but you're helping them with that counselor, that counselor role that you can take as a supervisor when you're hoping for that, to get to that mid-range on supervision, because you start out with teaching, and that's just that step-by-step, here's what we're going to do, and maybe here's some resources, and then you're hoping to get to that middle phase, which involves that counselor realm. And so that's what this can help with. What I do is, as I have them do it, I really like for them to recognize, how are these, traits that you have helpful? How are they going to be helpful for you as a counselor? And how can they have weaknesses that would be there as a counselor? And so they're trying to look at whether it's ethics or building the relationship with a client, or what a client might be coming in for is working in the counseling field and in the world, and whatever job they have, found to be able to start working on their hours. I mean, they're so excited about finishing school, and they feel like they've, had a huge accomplishment. And as we know, there's still a pretty long road, to get to that point of licensure the way that it's set up, whether that's good or bad. And so they're looking at that finish line. And I can't say that I was any different. I wasn't really going into it thinking, maybe, what do I really need to look for in a supervisor? Or what do I really need to consider so that I'm thinking about my career long term? Or, any of those types of things. It was just like, how do I get to the finish line? I was young, I'll admit, but I definitely followed that whole mentality of, life is a journey and not a destination. I wasn't there yet. So it was very much like destinations of checking off, the boxes to be able to get there. And so supervision, for me, and part of why I'm so passionate about these trainings, and I didn't say that part at the beginning, is just that the schooling that I had was incredible. It was a great experience. I wouldn't trade any of that. But what happened is that I ended up in a class where normally I found out just a couple of years ago where the board rules would have been discussed and they would have been gone through. And that professor was out on sabbatic that semester. And so I had someone else. I don't even remember who it was. It's too long ago, so I don't know. We're talking a couple of decades. So whenever that was, I had someone. So I never really knew they existed. And then I got into being supervised, and my supervisor, really we weren't doing anything following the board rules or ethics, or the amount of time we were supposed to do, or how often, or what it was supposed to look like. I still knew nothing. And so unfortunately, I'm sure on that application it must have said, like it does now, it spells out, have you read the board rules? Do you, the supervisor signing off on this? And back then, psychologists could supervise us, other licenses, social workers could supervise us. And I did have a couple of those experiences at the same time because I was working at a few places. So I had one that had our licensure who really gave me no knowledge that I really needed to be able to, be successful on this ethical side in the field. I had another one that didn't even hold my license, so they didn't know. They're not, they're not going to hold me to anything because they don't know. So thankfully, I was someone who tries to do things very ethically on my own anyway, but I really didn't know that those rules existed until a lot later. And that's when I started getting really passionate about supervision. Is like, okay, I did this training and I didn't really have anything that I needed as I got started. And then I started supervising, and then I figure out board rules, exist in some other pieces. And then I start reading them and looking at them, and I realize how many people don't know them, and that they're not following them because they were like me. I don't always think it's intentional, that everyone's choosing to ignore them, but there's that piece of just being naive and not knowing. And so all those pieces together between the supervision I experienced and trainings I went through and starting to supervise myself, and just recognizing the magnitude once you go to board meetings and you're seeing the ramifications of not knowing what's supposed to be happening, to be able to, keep from having to go to a board meeting, not voluntarily. And so with that, those became really the goals of the training. So that's been my heart in all of it, since some of you have not been around as long. So doing some activities like this helps build that relationship that, some of you may have had great supervision experiences, but I wouldn't say that I had a close relationship with any of the supervisors where it would continue. And so with mine, by building a relationship, the hope is that they continue to remain in the field, and that they're staying knowledgeable and they know what to expect and things that go on. So that's the first one. So they're really just looking at how their personality, impacts working with clients, and you could also bring in, and what I do is be able to talk about the differences between the two of us. So I bring in, what my bent is from having taken the UN assessment, and then we talk about, differences between how I respond to things, or how I the perspective that I may approach things with, and maybe their bent, and how they respond, how they react in their view. And so it helps us from the beginning know a little bit more about what our expectations can be, because obviously we're not going to change, everything about who we are while we're in supervision, but it just lets me know more of what to expect. I gave you on the next couple of pages the big positive that goes along with using the UN assessment is that there are some of these extra pieces that have come along that just people have developed over time. And so what I've done through the manual is just compile a lot of really great things that have come from people. So some of it is my own, and then some of it comes from others. And this one, came from another. So what happens is when you know what the bent of your supervisee is, so what, their personality type is what I do is I just look at those percentages that are more extreme. So if they are in, we'll say an ISFJ, and so they're an ISFJ, but all of it's like mid-range except for the J part. And so you're either on the 80% end, or it's just higher, it's 70 or above, I would say. If they have one of those, what you do is you can go to this chart and be able to look under the J piece where it says, judgers. And so you're looking at the supervision strategies of what they're going to need and the feedback strategies that they would prefer. And so they're going to want more of that structure and a plan for how things are going to be done and what those deadlines look like, and assign projects so they can get completed, which I'm going to be giving you plenty, so you could be using these if that's more their personality. And the feedback strategies, you're trying to structure it and really be consistent with it. So that's an example of how you would use it. So I don't necessarily look for every, style, letter, however you want to look at it. I don't necessarily look at every single category for them, but I'm going to look at the ones that I know are pretty strong for them so that I can tag that in the back of my head. And hopefully, just like a client, you're catering the counseling that you're doing to be beneficial for them. It's the same thing with the supervisee versus looking at, well, you just come to me and I have all the answers and I give it to you each week and then we sign off on ours and you get to the end. It has more to it that is personalized that could help them be able to reach that self-supervision and grow. When you know what your Myers-Briggs type would be, if you'll look at each of the categories for yourself on those next few pages, so starting on page 7, And I'm going to let you look through it. And I want you to find a couple of strengths from, looking at all 4 categories. What are a couple of my biggest strengths that would come from those? And then look at it and figure out what are a couple of the skills to work on that I know are going to be my weaknesses as I go along. So I'm going to give you a few minutes if you'll accomplish that. So a couple of strengths and characteristics that are listed there that you know are strong points, and then a couple of the skills to work on from all 4 of yours. For me, I know the percentage that I have that's the highest, which you may need to look at yours again to be able to know that answer, tends to be that J side, just because of that structure, which is so interesting because it's taken years for me to find some structure with all of this because it's just so loose. It's been, everyone supervises different ways. Everyone, does different things. And there really wasn't a structure to turn to or to look to. So although I tend to recognize, how important, and I know how important, all those paperwork pieces are, because that's why we end up before the board. It's always something that has to do with the J item of paperwork or log or something of that nature, not following through on something that we should have done. And although it's a strength for me, at the same time, I would say, the weaknesses that are listed there, focusing on the process and not the goals or deadlines, I do think that's gotten better. But I have found that even though it's something that, is more of a bent for me, because there are so many things that I'm doing, that this has slipped. It's much harder for me at this point. With the number of supervisees that I have, and there's another one about to come on, and so that would be 6, which is the most I've ever had, and more than I ever would have considered having, but that's a story we can talk about today. And so with that, it is very difficult. Like, I'll give them something and I'm forgetting who has turned it back in and who hasn't, and who I discussed it with and who I haven't, and it is more to keep up with, which is more, so I have to rely on them more to help, with that, because I can't keep tabs on all of it. So even though it's a strong piece for me, and the weaknesses have been there for sure, trying to allow that process to happen too, now recognizing the importance with supervision specifically, it's flipped to where now I'm much more about the process and the relationship. But you're also trying to keep up with all these deadlines that are there too. So whatever your bet may be, just pay attention, so that as you get started, if you haven't started with someone yet, and as you're getting started taking on several, is that even things that may be natural for you do become more difficult to keep up with as it goes along. One, a time frame that I like to use this is the way that the board works right now, and it's different for everyone because we're all in different situations and working with different people. But if you're in private practice, which some of you are, what happens is, when someone contacts you, you're trying to clarify if they've taken the exam and gotten that piece done, and you're trying to clarify if they have a site, which most of the time they don't. And so, they're wanting to ask about the supervision piece, but once they get the site and you're agreeing, yes, I will, work with you, and you're turning in that paperwork, the minimum time right now to be able to start supervising them and for them to get their intern license is a minimum of 3 months. I mean, it's not any shorter than that right now. And so you could be looking at signing on with someone like, yes, we're going to supervise together, and then you have like 3 months that you don't see them. I had someone just start, and that's part of that story, but they had come in, and probably against my better judgment, looking at it now, they were starting a doctorate program, and so they used the doctorate program as their site. I mean, eventually it will have hours at it, but it doesn't in the beginning. You're just doing classes, but it allowed them to put something on that line, and that is ethical to do because there will be hours there eventually. And so, yes, had my name on it, and that was a misstep on my part, because normally I will never sign on, with anyone unless they have a site. What happened in the process is that I just never heard back, and so it had been like a month or two, and I'm realizing I need to check back in on this. And so, checking back in on it, they ended up not starting that program. They were going to wait till the next semester. Well, what happened is that almost a year later, I get an email like, hey, I'm under your supervision now. I mean, it was a huge gap of time. Well, not only did they wait, but they didn't do that program. They ended up in a whole other program that I wasn't getting any information as like what was happening along the line. I just thought they had dropped out, like decided not to move forward. Things happen. And so I was very glad. I mean, at least there was the initiative to say, I do have my license now. My name is on the website under you, which I would have found out because of the trainings, hopefully pretty quickly. But there was that step taken. And so it was like, surprise, here's someone I have to start working with immediately. I mean, now. there's no option. Yeah, don't pass go. And so that's an example of, what happens is there can be these huge lag times, and that's why it's good not to sign on with someone until they know for sure where they're going to be. I say that, but yet I have someone else, and during that time frame, she ended up losing her job. And so then she ended up with another job. By the time her license finally came through and we could send in the other paperwork that says, let me take off this site, let me add on this site. And so even what I had signed on for had changed. So there's all these dynamics that go on because of these. I mean, 3 months doesn't sound like a long time, but when you're adding in, well, it is, a fourth of a year. A lot of things can happen. It is something to keep tabs on. So I like to use these, if possible, to give them to them once we have signed on, and I know that we're getting close to that point that they should be coming on board with me for supervision. If they've already got some of these completed and accomplished, then we can start out when we start meeting with these ready to go. Instead of kind of fumbling of now you have 50 clients a week if they're at someplace where they have a lot. I have a lot of supervisees right now who are barely just getting a few hours a week. And so that's not the case, and it's not a huge issue. But if they're at a hospital or, an agency where they're overloaded, it's very difficult to get these things in once they're already overwhelmed by everyone they're seeing, because you are trying to talk about as many cases as you can. So this would be an option of like emailing it to them and saying, hey, if you'll complete these few things before we get started on supervision, we'll use them, once you get here. So that's how I use it. When you go to the next activity, it's that personal preference role of the supervisor. And what I've done for the ones following, if you just chose, I don't really want to use that unit assessment, I want to use, something else, you could do that. And there are some other options here. The personal preference role of the supervisor, what it is you can tell it's divided it into categories. So that first one's needing that detailed instructions, how work should be done, wanting that feedback, closely being monitored. Well, it has, behind it in the parentheses, teacher. So if you were following, the model of Bernard and Goodyear, who are the founding fathers of supervision, this would be what you would be utilizing is looking at, am I in that teacher role with them? The counselor one is when you're helping them look at the relationship aspects of supervision, sharing their own feelings and responses to work. For me, I would say I don't remember anything really taking place that involved that counselor role when I was in supervision. It was case consultation, there was teaching that went on, but I don't remember thinking about a certain client I was working with and had anything I had been through ever impacted my work with them or had much insight, any more insight into myself versus the counseling I was required to do in my program, anything similar to that. So the consultant one goes into, solving problems, being challenged, evaluating themselves. It's all, the consultant one is like a consultant. So we're more on the same level of I can trust them to be able to find, a lot of resources or techniques or, think through something new to use. And then we can talk about how it went, afterwards, or talk about another option that they could have pursued if they had chosen to do that. So that's personal preference role. The field dependent versus field independent, which is that activity 4. And for that one, it is some of the same things. The field dependent is seeking feedback, wants to work in groups, needs those guidelines, wants to know what a supervisor thinks about something. Independent is some of that I can work alone and I'll figure it out, some as I go. I've got enough confidence that if I have those basics, I can, go with it. And we all, a lot of times it goes back to love languages. we want to give what we wanted and didn't get when we were in supervision ourselves. So when I started, I definitely didn't have that teaching piece of here's, I wanted the nitty gritty of kind of step by step, when you sit in a session, here's how you go through the paperwork, and, that we have at this practice, and here's what, here are the steps we're going to take after that, and here's some things you could do with clients. I really wanted more specific information, and it was more broad in general, and so I just kind of learned as I went on my own, the hard way, through good and bad. So that's, another one that you could use that really is just looking at their personality style. Probably, like we were alluding to earlier, how much experience have they had in the field? Someone who's had more experience would probably be able to be more independent, whereas someone who hasn't is going to want, to be more dependent on you initially. So those are, lots of options. And the last one I've given you is that activity 5, which is the internally or externally driven. And that one looks at more personality, I would say, than experience or, the role that we're in as a teacher, counselor, consultant. For the internally or externally driven, it's looking at their personality style. Like, do they need someone to be giving them those deadlines and motivating them and staying on top of their paperwork and, helping hold them accountable? Or are they someone that can do those things more naturally themselves, and keep up with those? So that is more personality style than it is supervision related as to what phase of supervision that they're in. So any of those could be used. Do you have any questions about when to give them or how to incorporate them or what that would look like? Okay. For me, the UNE assessment is the one I've used a majority of the time. If you wanted to use one of the other ones, what you can do is just, email it to them and ask them which style is more theirs. Just take off the parentheses at the end. Or you could leave it because it does bring up a good conversation to have with them about, here's where I'm hoping that will be by the time we finish supervision is in this consultant phase, or here's where do you see yourself right now, and here's what that means for me in the role that I would be in. So it does bring up some good discussion if you want to leave it, or you can take it off and just have them, be able to select and let you know. It also can give you a lot of insight into, their insight and let you know, like, are they overly confident? Are they really insecure, and so they're trying to appear overly confident? What the concerns you need to have are. And I would say with every supervisee, it's obviously going to be different. So those are things to keep in mind. The supervision genogram activity is that 6th one. And the way that you can use this one is I really like to know the supervision experiences that they've had to this point. So all that it is that they're creating a genogram, as we call it, but it's not necessarily like 3 levels of a family or anything like that. It's one line, and they're being able to say, like, this relationship was positive or this one was negative, and able to give, some details on that. That is really helpful for me because it brings up those questions that I've given you below, like, what have you enjoyed in supervision in the past that you want to be a part of supervision now? What are there areas of practice or topics you want to learn more about? What characteristics of your past supervision are you hoping will not be a part of our supervision relationship? It's almost like interviewing in a way, because if you were interviewing for a job, you're wanting to know, what things have you really enjoyed about your past jobs, or what things, did you not enjoy as much? It's similar, but it allows for some of that. You're really wanting open conversation so you can get to know them more, to know what level that they're at and how far you're going to need to go. So that one tends to be one that gives me a lot of insight, because it also lets you know what type of relationship that they want to have with you, which goes into activity number 7, and that one's the attachment style. It took me a while to recognize how similar supervision is to parenting, and I now tell my supervisees that and let them know those things up front, not in a derogatory way that they're my child or demeaning them in some way, but the relationship that they had with their parent growing up, you are definitely, whatever transference or countertransference, can occur, can definitely, occur through the relationship. There's one from the past that I knew there was this awkwardness about it. She was one of my first ones. But again, I'm a harmony person. I'm not knowing how to address it, it's not clear. I'm not sure, what the struggle was. And there were also discussions about difficulties she was having with a coworker. And that went on through a lot of our supervision too. Not that it was counseling and we were discussing the coworker the whole time, but it was impacting work with clients and how they shared clients and what they were doing. And so it's like a client, you don't really know, like, is she the one causing some of the problems? Is it the other person causing the problems? Like, I'm not there. I don't know. I don't have the whole system in front of me to be able to know, what's going on. So at the time, because I could sense, this tension that was there in supervision itself, I would have guessed that maybe it could have been her. But then I ended up having another employee from that place and ended up finding out it was, more the other person than it was her. That the supervision relationship was impacted. This was someone who was, she was from another country. She had kind of grown up. She definitely grew up without both parents, and there was some separation from a parent as they were getting into the country, and there were just a lot of dynamics that were there that definitely attachment was impacted. And now, knowing what I know about attachment now, and how important that is, being more in kind of the adoption and foster care realm of doing things with a lot of the kids that I've got coming through here, is that side of realizing, yes, like it does impact. The attachment style quiz that I've given you is just on a website. It's not necessarily going to change your life or going to change their life, but the goal is with any of these, you're hoping that they get some insight. Like, do they have some insight as to what they, how it can impact the supervision relationship, as to what they've experienced, as to how things could be different than what they grew up with and experienced. And so we just look at, the relationship that you had with your parents. Unfortunately, supervision can be a lot like that, in that you may want to avoid telling me things, because you're insecure and you're afraid of how I'm going to respond, or there may be things, that are going to be really difficult to bring up because you know that they're weaknesses that you have. And so that helps, that encouragement and cheerleading, side of really being a support for them and letting them know, that you're on their side, while at the same time addressing something that may be there from the past with attachment. So now, with the supervisees, this is not one that I've been able to use yet. There is a supervisee that I have that it has been a difficult start, and probably would have been really beneficial had I had this and we could have talked through it a little bit more. I had done the supervision genogram, and we had done the Myers-Briggs, and we had done some of those. And eventually, now it has cleared up, but it took me having to really confront some of that tension and being able to say, I'm really confused. It seems, like you're really dissatisfied with supervision, or you're unhappy with supervision. I really want you to be at a place with someone, where you want to be. And the feedback ended up being like, no, like, I really want to be with you. What am I doing to portray that? And it was a definite portrayal. And so it was just this awkwardness as we got started. And now, we've been in for more than a few months, and so it has subsided. But some things that had to happen, and I got really confused in the process as we get to evaluations. So we have this attachment thing. So, I'm giving her some things every week, that she could be doing. There's not anything that I could say she was doing absolutely wrong where I was having to say, don't do that, absolutely not. It was just more, well, you could try this, or, here's another option. What other things can you think of that might be able to work? And so I felt like we were working together to try to come up with those. But when it came time for the evaluation, there's definitely an overachiever wanting to present as a perfectionist, I would say, and definitely presenting like that initially, which we all know nobody can be perfect. And so I already knew, okay, there's some insecurity that's being hidden without insight, into that. I have a couple right now that are, I would say, although we really would like for interns to be doing trainings, and these two are trainingaholics from the standpoint of probably too many expectations and goals and not enough of what we were alluding to earlier of kind of sit back and like get some experience. It's not necessarily going to a training that's going to give you everything you need to work with a client. You've got to figure out how to build rapport with them. And so honestly, I was not giving as many things in those first weeks, like homework wise. We had done some of these on the front end because they were doing something every time I saw them. They had watched a video, they'd read a book, they'd gone to a training, they'd done this. Like 2 or 3 things every week even. And I was like, I'm not adding on to this. And I think there was some frustration, that I wasn't saying, well, here's a resource or here's this. And really, I'm just saying, like, let's sit back. I knew what I felt like needed to happen. So when it came time for the first evaluation, which I tried to do early on, my marks were pretty positive for them. There are some things to work on, but there was nothing, from the evaluation I was using that I was overly concerned about or that I needed to mark more negatively on. We're just getting started. But on the evaluation that she filled out for me, there were several that were negative. And so I was kind of confused. I was like, okay, I'm very confused in that moment. Sometimes, it takes me longer. I'm a slow processor. So there's this poly perfect and doing all these trainings and, okay, I realize like they're wanting a little bit more. And then I'm very confused because now there's these negative remarks after wanting to look perfect and have all these things together. So I ended up, talking with another colleague here about it, and we were talking, and there was that light bulb moment of, you have been giving her some things to work on every week, and she feels like you're judging her as if she's not good enough, or, like I'm just supposed to encourage and never give any other options. Like that's every option that's out there. You did them all. I'm not sure what I don't know that she really thought that, but that was the perception, of how she was responding to things. So the evaluation was more about, it gave her the opportunity like to mark me, and to judge me. So I wasn't taking it personally. I was just really confused, like, what happened is I ended up, because you're trying to communicate and form a relationship like you want them to with the client. And we were trying to walk through, I was like, okay, like I'm seeing some of these things, like if this, if I was trying to even scale, I think a little solution focused, like if this moved, to a 3 or to a 4, what would be different? And it was this deer in the headlight. I have no clue. I cannot give you any examples. It was awkward, very awkward for me too. And I'm like, what am I, trying to accomplish, and where do I go from here? So what ended up happening was there were those marks, but then there was no backup. It wasn't like she really had some constructive criticism to give or could say, like, here are some other things I'm wanting out of supervision that I know of, unless she was still too insecure to bring them up in that moment. But it was like just staring, and then it was like, well, never mind, just never mind. Just wanting me to like throw the evaluation in the trash and pretend it never happened. So yes, like there was no communication. So it was really awkward. And in my beginning days, I have no clue what I would have done. I probably wouldn't have been doing the evaluation, so I just wouldn't have known. But I was thankful, that we had some of those moments to work through. And it was even before that, I think it was before even that evaluation that I had said, it seems like, you're unhappy with supervision in some ways. It was just reaction and just kind of demeanor. And there's this like unfriendliness kind of wall, that I would say was there. And it just was creating some difficulty. But ever since doing that evaluation and unfortunately through email, having to say, like, is this really what you're wanting? Now it's great. But I know, like, and I already knew there was stuff, that needed to be worked through. And I knew that they were doing the right thing. They were still in some counseling, for things that they had been through. So while they're working with clients and with me, and that's a huge encouragement. They had insight in recognizing that they need that. But there was this big void, that ended up there. So attachment style could have helped me on that front end, because I probably could have realized some things. And we have talked about some of those since then, that growing up and relationship with parents was not, a positive situation. I don't know all the details. I don't, I have not made her my client. I don't know every little scenario of how she was impacted or the effects, but I know enough, and she recognizes enough to know it definitely can impact relationships. And it's opened the door, because there has been insight to recognize when I'm with this type of client who's dealing with something that I've dealt with that's really significant from my past, I'm treating them differently. And she ended up bringing that up and saying, I'm doing something different. I spend more time with these people. I'm getting more information. And part of it was the setting she's in is not a setting where she can stay with these people long term. It's more like you get a couple of times to get enough information and do like an assessment is what it's supposed to be. That she was going deeper with those, to where, having been through her own personal life experience, she was trying to get them started in counseling. And it was a good discussion of saying, like, it's really setting them up for disappointment, because now they've shared their entire story, in these 2 times. And then it's like, okay, see you later. You've got to start with someone else and start over. So we came up with a game plan of how can you encourage them and support them, and maybe even, which I don't do a lot, but like self-disclose somewhat, like, I've been through this before, and I know it's going to be a hard road. But really structuring for them, like, here's what we're trying to accomplish in these next couple of times, so I can set you up, and make sure that we have done an assessment so you're ready to start counseling. Because the goal of these 2 is not to be able to give you everything you need. And that was not happening before. So it was more like counseling would be here, as I look at, like, let me do an assessment. I'm going to stay with you for 3 months. And, so I'm trying to get all the details, but it wasn't benefiting them, and it wasn't going to benefit her. Whereas with the other client, she could remain removed, and it was just more of an assessment. And I don't know how much of a joining there was, but there was the ability to stay apart. So if that gives you examples, like, these are real life examples of supervision and how some of these activities could help you in the long run and be able to see, the benefits that could come from it. The values clarification is a newer one that I found that I do absolutely. I mean, this is a foundational one that I won't trade for anything at this point. I ended up finding it on a play therapy. It's on the Association for Play Therapy website, and that's why it's got Terry Cotman on it. And as you saw in these activities, a lot of them have afterwards, I gave the reference for where it came from. So I like you to know it wasn't necessarily mine. It's things that I pulled together. For hers, the benefit of this and how it ends up being such a huge foundational piece is that they are going through and marking what I have them do is separate than what it tells you. So you might want to make note of that. It says rate each of them from 1 to 5 on how important it is to you in supervision. Well, it's a really long list, and I'm all about being simple because I've got a lot of supervisees and I won't be able to remember all of it otherwise. So what I'm having them do is just rank their top 5. So they're doing it, what are your top 5 priorities of, what is valuable to you while you're in supervision with me and that you hope to have by the end. And what is great about it, they all come up with different answers. Most of the time, I would say it centers on things that it could be exploring the theoretical approach, or there are some on here that are about giving more resources or having new techniques or therapy strategies. It's focused on that technical side. Whereas when I fill the one out for me, which is on the next page where it says for supervisors, mine are all about honest, integrity, ethical, paperwork filled out. It's all of those because those are the things that can get me in trouble. And so that's what's my main priority. And it's really good because it lets them see, these are the things that are my priority, and here's why. My ultimate job is to make sure that you get to the end of your hours and you get to count every one of them, and we have done it exactly like we were supposed to do. When they come out of school, and even sometimes if they've had some experience, they're focused on, how can I become them, or how can I broaden my therapy skills? It's a whole other perspective and mindset that is very different from what I'm coming in with, of, it being a journey, and, let's build this relationship through it, that could last long term if it needs to. And also, be able to help them recognize what is important in the field, what's important that they be doing, so they don't end up in trouble, in the field. I just never realized the magnitude of, one complaint, and the magnitude of what that can do, to not necessarily that you're always going to lose your license, but there are a lot of other factors that play in, some of which we'll talk about today. But when you're looking at over 1,000 days or more to resolve a complaint, you're sitting for 3 years wondering, am I going to lose my license? Am I going to have a fine? Am I going to, what's going to happen? And it's important for them to know. So there's a part of what I would say is like a healthy fear of, the board or the government, or however you want to look at the entity, because they are in charge of our licenses. And so there needs to be a healthy fear there, and them recognizing where it's coming from, just like a parent wants their child to be grateful for what you're buying them or doing for them, same kind of thing. So whereas they may come in out of school with the same expectations they had in school, teach me everything I didn't know, it's really good because it lets me say, well, here's what I'll be really focusing on. I know that can be disappointing at times, but in the end, you'll be able to appreciate that, because they know that they can trust you, and they're going to know what's important, versus you can read all the books on theory yourself. I could teach it, but you can do all of that on your own, and I don't know everything. I'm not the be-all, end-all, and you're never going to know everything in this field, and I think that's good for them to know and to get a grasp on, pretty early on. So that's where the values clarification, becomes something that can really be beneficial.
Do you incorporate any, business practice stuff in your supervision? Do you teach them anything about running a practice?
I have not to this point. Those types of things, there are people that promote their supervision saying, I will teach you everything about private practice. So you'll be ready to start your by the time we finish. But the problem is that the board could care less about them learning any of that information. And from my viewpoint, from the consultations that I do and the people that I help with running business and those types of things, is that it really just needs to be something separate. Because again, it depends on each person's experience and what they've been through, but that's not the ultimate goal. If they're coming in with that goal, it's probably not someone I want, because like you said, it's someone graduating wanting to take over my practice in a year, kind of thing. Yeah. So it's how it's that mindset of how fast can I get to the finish line so I can take all the shortcuts, instead of having to go through some of the experiences and really figure out, am I even good at this? They haven't even done it yet. They don't even know if they'd be good at it in private practice, much less anything else. So you're really, there are things that I look for in supervisees, and that's where, humility comes in. So if I'm interviewing someone, I can tell you that is a huge turnoff for me. If I'm hearing, yes, I want to work here and I want to have my own practice in a couple of years, and I'm thinking in my head, knowing the overall perspective of how long it takes to train to get someone on here. Not that we don't hire people that don't work out, because that can happen. Every year there are people that have not worked out that I have poured into. But there's just so much more that could be learned in supervision. And the board, I've been at meetings, and they're very clear on it too. The person I have who really has no sight right now, because they're getting no hours. She just started with me, and I had someone that I had to let go from here, talking about letting people go, who stayed with me as a supervisee. And so he went 6 months with no sight, and we still met every week. But there was so much that needed to be worked on. Even though we're moving as slow as a snail, I would say we are finally at some places where there's some insight, and I can really give some of that criticism, and I can ask some questions, and there will be that lack of insight. But then, like yesterday was an example, and then that insight comes and it's like, well, maybe that's a problem, that I have. And so then there's that willingness to work on it. But we needed that 6 months because I knew why I had to let them go, which was not being able to build rapport, and there was no client retention. So in staying with me, I knew I'm keeping someone that's, been a weak link for me, and we need to make some progress. So I just tried, as much as I could, to bring in other things. That's where all these activities come in. That's where you, can be able to have them explore more of why they went into the field. You could be doing so many things and teaching so many things that really don't have anything, client situations of when a client commits suicide, when a client does this, when a client asks to video your session or audio tape it, when they want to FaceTime in with their ex-spouse, like all these situations that we're not taught in school that come up every day. Yeah. You can talk about all of them. So they get some more real life experience. But I also have the tendency when something like that is going on, to try to do the groups, on a regular basis, so they're hearing from others, even if they're not getting hours themselves, so they can hear someone else that is one of my stronger links, of a supervisee, and that I know really has some skills. So they're, I would say probably the most rewarding supervising experience I've ever had is one that I have right now. And it's taken this, long to say this is one I've had, I'm going to have them from start to finish, and it has absolutely been the best. But why is that? Well, because they've been counseling for a decade and they have a ton of experience, but they didn't get their license, and they realized they're at that point of, I'm not going to be able to get it. And so they have so much information. It started out as a consult, more of a consultation relationship and supervision than that beginning. So that it's easy, and we like easy, but sometimes it isn't always easy. So it's having to recognize you're going to have way more that may be like a client. They never really get to that mark of what you thought they could get to, and they just quit coming. Then it is going to be people you have from their first hour to the last hour. It's going to be a slim amount. And I came in with the expectation, because that's what I had done, that you just get someone when they finish school and you keep them until the very end, and then you get another one and you keep them till the very end. And that is, a very small number of, the supervisees that you'll end up finishing with. Most of mine have been with someone else. You end up transferring out because they find free supervision, or they change jobs, or whatever it might be. They come to me because they were unhappy with the supervision they had for one reason or another. They already had another license and they're wanting this license. There's just so many scenarios that don't look like, hey, I just finished school and I'm going to do my hours and I'll finish. So if that helps kind of burst the bubble of what expectations, can look like, I think it's all over, Well, and every agency does things very differently when it comes to that, too. So, I know you've been in a lot of agency settings, whereas in private practice, sometimes, we learn the game and we know how to do it and we know how to explain it, And so there's so many approaches. So those pieces, I would say, with like diagnosing and treatment planning, those all come into supervision, because those are those beginning details that you want to make sure that they know what they're supposed to be doing. But there are so many different avenues between agencies and hospitals and nonprofits, and then there's self-pay private practice, and there's insurance private practice, and we could keep going, on how many dynamic. So that's one thing with supervision that I would say is, that would be another part when you were asking about, am I trying to teach them about private practice world, is that I really have to keep in mind, and some people have argued this in the past, but I just look at it like there are a lot of jobs in this field, and there are a lot of pieces of it that could be administrative and more like pushing paper or a caseworker or some different things. And there are some that are, you're seeing 32 clients a week and it's like private practice oriented. So not every supervisee I have, and I would say, a big bulk of them that I've supervised from the outside are not people who would succeed here. They're not people that would succeed at what I'm doing on a day in, day out basis. But I have to realize, like, that's not my expectation. They feel called to the field. I've got to figure out how we can use what their gifting is, because they do have one. If they can't build a lot of rapport with the client, yes, we need to work on that. But there's something. I mean, there's going to be something that they're going to find if this is what they have felt called to do. Yeah. And so I'm not trying to prepare them for one thing, because I don't know what that one thing is. They may be miserable in their intern hours, and I know a lot of us were miserable in our intern hours, depending on where we were doing them. So I know, there are a lot of experiences that can be out there. And so that's a great question, though, and that some people, that's how they get supervisees in. But then you've got this whole, detrimental side of, did they really get what they needed out of supervision? And even when I've done consults, with people who were trying to redo what we've done here, I'll say, like, if they've bought our paperwork or they've consulted with me, how do I make what you've done and create that? And I've had people try to do it. But if they don't have the same values or motives going into it, then it's not going to work as well. And I've seen that happen. So, I mean, I've tried, but it goes back to the culture, of what you've set up and why you're doing what you're doing. And theirs happen to be a little bit different than mine. And so it's working. I mean, they're profitable. They're making it. But the culture's completely different, even though you can slap on paper, okay, I have the same values. It's different.
Not like a franchise type of a thing.
Yes. Yes.
Just
so
do one of these and it'll work.
So if I struggle doing that with licensed professionals who are successful and who are out there, and I'm happy to meet with them and kind of get them on that road where they can ask me some questions and try to get some wisdom for some shortcuts. But can they just duplicate it? I haven't seen that happen in a totally positive way. So people say to me, culture is caught, it's not taught. And so slapping on paper is not going to, okay, we're this. so with a supervisee, I think it's just setting their expectations on something that may or may not ever happen for them. And then I've spent half the time teaching them about something that really, is not going to have an impact, or maybe setting them up to fail. And do I want to be the one setting them up to fail when we know how many businesses fail? I mean, no. So that's my perspective. Other people will have lots of different viewpoints, and I totally recognize that and understand that. So, but you're asking something that's a really good question to ask you. Well, let's take a break before we get into board rules. we'll talk about that, which is a good one. Well, it is. When you were asking earlier, I mean, that's a great topic with supervision, because when you're asking about, do you teach them private practice things or things, a lot of times they are interns, are either seeing clients or doing work that isn't necessarily what they want to do long term in their career. And so that's the benefit of supervision, is being able to expose them to some of what you are doing or some other things you have done and what some other clients could look like, so they know what those options are. And that gives them a wealth of knowledge to know, okay, if I can survive this time, this journey, then I can continue to move forward. So there is so much to expose them to outside of, they only may be working with one population doing one thing. And we're in a field right now where, some people are on that side. There's always, every perspective, but some people are on the side of, you need to choose your one thing, and that's your specialty, and that is, that's your, that's what you're going to roll with, and that's all you're going to do. But then I have the struggle of, like, we're hiring one of those right now. Tons of experience when it comes to the kids and the parent groups, and I mean, all of these different issues with kids and all kinds of things. But when you're wanting to start into private practice and really do hours in it and you're getting started, if you're wanting to be able to build clientele, you're going to have to be more open, to seeing other things. So I really struggle, with people doing that during their internship or during a practicum, because what happens is you get licensed and you decide, well, maybe I'll see couples. Well, they think you know what you're doing. You're licensed. They don't know that you've never had one. Yes. And so I really try to, I do have one. She's licensed now, and she has never seen a couple or probably really worked with an adult. And the struggle is, it benefited the supervisor she was with, because that's what she was doing, and it helped her make money, and was great for her practice, and there were clients to see. But at the same time, she could have encouraged her to either do some volunteer hours at something else, just a few hours, or to get some exposure to another experience. And that's a topic that comes up with supervisors a lot of, if it's a school counselor, do you require them to get another job in the summer so they get exposed to something else? I wouldn't say it's something I require. I do think it would be very beneficial, just something, even if it's not a job, but it's just volunteering. So the school world is very different, as you know, than a lot of other realms within this field. And to be able to get exposure to something else, could be a huge benefit. So there are lots of options as supervisors that we can help encourage or expose them to versus just cornering them into one spot that they only know things about one set of clients and one set of issues.
I have a question kind of based on what we talked about earlier, but if we need to move on, it's okay. How do you feel about interns or even pre-intern really wanting to do a lot of specialized training, like not licensed, but really wants to do play therapy, and probably if they could get into an EMDR class, they would do it. Like, I mean, you talked about your people that are training junkies.
Yes.
So my personal kind of side of it is, as a licensed person, is I don't know that you really have all the skill to really have those credentials, or I'm not sure that it's wise to have all of them like at the very beginning. But do you have a take on that?
I do have a take on that, just because of the couple that I have. I have one, the schools are really big right now at promoting, especially now that August is when it's moving to this new bridge of you have to do 60 hours instead of 45 or 48 to be able to graduate. So even people who have just graduated, I know someone specifically, I put them under supervision with someone here, it was a friend, and she is not getting a lot of hours. She's at a school, she's not in a position as a counselor, but she wanted to go ahead and start as an intern, because if she waited, then she'd have to go back to school to get enough hours to then become an intern, to then keep going. So there's all these, gateways that you're trying to get through. And so there's that side of things, of people who are getting in, knowing they're not doing a lot with it in the beginning, Then there's this other side of the schools are really promoting to get as many licenses as you can. So I had one start, the one that I'm, have referred to, that we had this huge gap of time with no site and these types of things. And starting was like, I want to be an LPC, I want to be an LMFT, and I want to be a CSAT, a certified sex addiction therapist, and I want to do EMDR, and I think those were the main ones to start. And so I was trying for the journey thing of like, let's just slow down a little bit. And the struggle with that is it's just a few hours every week. They had a full-time job that was not in this field and that they were going to be retiring from, so you can tell they're older. And so this was going to be what they wanted to pursue after retirement. So they're barely getting, hours and just barely chipping away. But yes, there's all this expectation of what they wanted to pursue. And so yes, we can do both the licenses, and I think they may have mentioned the LCDC, and I think I just said halt, like on that. I mean, I don't have control over that necessarily. They could do what they want to do, but it was not something that I was wanting them to pursue right then. And so they have, this is the one that has the most difficulty with client retention and rapport. They have done a level of EMDR, maybe this, you have to have two to be able to finish. Okay, they've done one. And they've done the supervision with me. And then when they did get another site, that site was like us here, and that we require supervision to be within for our employees that are working here. So then they had to have the supervisor there, but that supervisor wasn't duly licensed. So they had one license with that supervisor. They were still seeing me for the other license. And they can, along with doing the EMDR, they went to the 2 levels of CSAT training, which you have to fly out of town, you have to stay in a hotel, you have to do all that. And you have to be under supervision for that, for the certified sex addiction therapist. So they've had 3 supervisors, barely getting hours, as they're going along. And just that difficulty of trying to get to a point of having some insight to be able to build rapport with clients, and be able to make it a little bit further. So that would be an example of, that is way more than I would have suggested or, wanted them to be doing. And I tried to share some of my perspectives, But this is also a situation of someone that lacks a lot of insight because they believe they're very teachable and would say that they're very teachable when things are proposed, but in reality, they're not. Like I'll bring something up and it's immediately, well, no, I did that, or I already tried that, or yeah, I said that, or it's like whatever you say or do, they've already done it all. And so it's made it very difficult, to try to make progress. But we've had these huge, what I feel like were life-changing light bulb moments that maybe, there was a huge insight that was gained in a couple of different times, where I've just had to force some of that insight to take place. And so to answer your question, as in, do I encourage them, get every license you can and do everything you can? No, because they're not understanding that's more boards you're under. If you have a complaint, it's with every board. You have to resolve all of those complaints, and then if there are lawsuits or different things that come out of that. So it can get very maddening, in the process. And the sad part, it has been, there's a part of it that's been, sad to see too, but one of those supervisors told them to do something very, unethical when it came to reporting abuse. It was very clear, and there was a definite, I would say, danger in a way. And so they told them to do something that totally doesn't follow the rules, what I would have said to do. So we kind of backtracked once they saw me. So here we're getting like two sets of people saying different things and what to follow through on. And then one of the other supervisors ended up having an inappropriate relationship with a client and jetted out of town, and so they're losing their license. They're probably going to be going, to prison for a while, which that was that perspective. I think of the board, but I don't think of the inappropriateness with a client that has, these other, situations that come along with it and consequences outside of just the board. Then it ends up being a felony. Then you end up, with time that you have to do. And so it has been, sad to see kind of the journey that's taken place, but I had to make the decision that I had to make because of what was, happening here. But that then led to some other situations and just having to trust. So I
didn't really think about all the different contributors. Supervision is enough. It's hard work to go through.
It's a lot.
Your supervision process, but
so if they were wanting EMDR,
yeah, feedback and
what to do. I have had someone do Gottman, before they did a level of that as an intern. I think doing EMDR, a level of that, or maybe even getting certified, it's hard because you don't have the experience to be able to really understand how it could be used or how effective it could be or what it's like to do counseling without it. But I don't think it would be harmful. It's more for me, all the licensures, along with if you're trying to pursue 3 or 4 different huge certifications that are thousands of dollars. It's a lot of investment of time and effort.
A lot of expectation that goes with that too.
There is. There is.
It's chaotic.
It feels chaotic.
Or even for the supervisee, just thinking, trying to put myself in those shoes.
Right.
You do 3 hours of supervision a week.
Yes.
Well, kind of we don't advise our clients to see 4 different therapists for good reason. It's the same idea. It's how many different perspectives are you getting, and are you integrating that, or are they fighting each other, and
what's happening?
Yeah.
In supervision, sometimes people will say, well, why would someone want to have 2? What would be good reasoning behind that? And that happens because someone is working, we'll say at an agency or doing some volunteer hours somewhere, and they do offer free supervision and they really encourage them to do it there. And so that makes sense to me. That supervisor is only supervising for that agency, probably does no one outside. They're probably not even familiar with the paperwork or wouldn't remember all the things they need to be doing. They just know how to do it for that entity. So when they choose to work in private practice or, somewhere else, volunteering somewhere else, they have to get someone else to cover those hours. And I was very similar to that in my internship. It was just I had that psychologist, and then I had, the one that did have my licensure, and unfortunately I wasn't getting, some of what I needed from either side of that. But that would be an example of why someone would want to do 2, is it's related to the jobs they're working. It wasn't about, for me, I want I need one for all these different licenses or certifications. It was just what I had to do to be able to count the hours where I was getting them. So it can make sense. And I am all about a supervisor staying with what they know and in their realm, and have seen many, at board meetings who chose and said, well, sure, I'll help you with those hours, and just didn't realize everything else they needed to do for that person. I mean, they went into it good-hearted, but it ended up being miserable for everyone in the end. So I'm all about staying in the realm of what you know too. But those are great questions. The next one is the board rules and the code of ethics. And I don't know. I mean, we're at a time right now. I don't know what you know and what you don't know. As of just the last couple of weeks, few weeks, the Sunset Commission has met, and so if you are kind of naive and not knowing everything that happened with that, it does change dynamics, and I won't go into all those details. If you want to ask me more about it later, I used to be on one side, and I realized it's because it's what that side wanted me to hear and wanted me to believe, when really there was another side that was being more hidden to the reality behind it. So what that means is that our board will be dissolving as of right now. They've made that decision that it will dissolve by October of 18. And so it's really unknown in that, yes, we have these rules and we need to recognize that. And as they continue to have more proposed ones, we need to recognize that too. And, is something going to change? I don't think so, because Sunset has met so many times that this seemed like it was the final decision from what I know. Right now is that October 18 things would change. So there are a lot of unknowns at this point as to who would be making the rules and how much consulting really happens with what is now our current board for changes to be taking place. So we would just be shifting from under what right now is dishes, which is the Health and Human Services, and we'd be shifting over to licensing and regulation. And that's where medical doctors are, and electricians and plumbers. And there's a lot of different people that are already under this licensing and regulation. We just have happened to stay under, as a mental health profession, under dishes. So there will be changes. So even what we talk about today, I would say stay in the know, because your supervisees need to know. They don't have a clue. They don't know what Sunset is, and I guarantee in school they haven't talked about it. And in school, what tends to happen is that with supervisees, the rules that they tend to go over are all the ACA's rules, just the American Counseling Association, which has nothing to do with our state or the entity that's licensing them specifically. It's just an association they can be a part of. So what I would say is don't make any assumptions at all that they know anything that's in the rules. So what I do is at the end of today, I'll give you the thumb drive, and that was the biggest part of coming here, is that everything that you have in this manual activity-wise or form-wise is all electronic on the thumb drive. So the best thing for you to do really early on, and I've learned my lesson more than once, is to give them, it's a 10-page set, and it depends on their licenses and different things like that. But what they do is they go through, and it walks them through. They have to page by page find what the rules are and what the answers are to the questions being asked. I've written it Jeopardy style, so they're statements that are given, and they're writing basically like a question in return to that. But a lot of times they'll just write the answer, and that's fine. So it'd be like this many continuing education credits are due each renewal period. Well, what is 24, kind of thing. So what I did is I gave you the set to be able to give them for them to complete it, which does take many, many hours. People through the training, have said, sometimes it's between 6 and 10, sometimes a little more. And then what I also gave you was the questions and answers together, the statements with the answers together, so that you already have them and you could be able to grade it and be able to walk through it together. This one, at times I've given a little later, but I had my situations that have happened. I had someone start. It's one of the ones that I've been talking about, and so it was not intentional at all, but it was on me. I had not checked all social media as they had gotten started. So, I mean, I had discussed, what email needed to look like, that it had to, if you, to have the credential, it needs to have my name listed afterward with my credentials. We had talked about some things like that. And the website, they were working for an agency. It was correct. I had looked up. I just hadn't looked into everything. And there was a Psychology Today, which I've never really addressed. I'm still a little confused why it's there, because they work for other places, not on their own. But it basically, kind of like you're saying, people could call and try to get a session. But it was saying, it was completely off in that it said LPCI. It had the -I, but then it also said candidate, which really isn't even a credential that you can use. But then it also, and she was an intern by that point, so she just hadn't been on it, I think, in a while, because she doesn't use it. So it had this candidate piece that really didn't belong, but then it also didn't say intern. And what ended up happening, I got my little hand slap, was that someone who is at the board meetings very frequently and is nearby, and even someone that I know. I'm not personal friends with them, but I've been through trainings they've done. I have met them on several occasions and know them in that way. And so they ended up going onto the board website, looking for who her supervisor was, finding my contact information by searching on the web, and then emailing both of us and saying, you better take this down before some disgruntled board member finds this and reports you to the board, and this kind of thing. And it was very direct. It wasn't, negative. I didn't view it as negative in any way. It was just very direct. And of course, for me, like some other supervisor, I don't know how they would respond, but I was mortified, because here I am, like, leading these trainings. I know exactly what they're supposed to be doing, and so here I am getting this hand slap. And so I immediately, of course, emailed her, which she had gotten the other one, and just said, please take this down, immediately, or get it changed. And it did get changed, but it was because I didn't give these on the front end. Like, you make assumptions, and you should never make assumptions with supervisees, what they know and what they don't know. And so I started giving this really early on, I had someone else who, because they're duly licensed, they thought, well, I can open a private practice, because they're LMFT. Well, you can as an LMFT associate, but you can't as an LPC intern. And because you chose to do both licenses, you chose to not have that option. And so, things to me that I would think would be really clear and solidified really aren't for them. So I would highly recommend, that one on the early stages versus the later stages. I was probably within the first 4 to 6 weeks of supervising that one when I got that email. And so I had not gotten there yet, and I should have, and learned my lesson again that time. So the other way that it's really beneficial is that you find out what they know, because most of the time, even people coming to the supervisor training, they just Google LPC board rules and something pops up and they go there, but it is not the most recent set. And so they're trying to complete questions and they can't find information. And that happened to one of my supervisees. They didn't let me know how much they were struggling. It was just a couple weeks of like, I haven't gotten it done yet. Well, then they really tried to do it. They were like, I'm going to have it done by this time. And they couldn't find anything. And I said, how did you get the board rules? Where did you go to get that information? Well, I Googled it. And I was like, you can't Google it. Like, you have to go to the board website. And then you have to go to the spot that says board rules. And then you go into rules and regulations, and then it has the link, and then you go to that link. And it was really good because it helps them know, I've got to go to this website more often, and I need to find out what's going on. And that also makes them sign up for the email updates so that then they know when the rules are changing or when something's happening, which is something else that I highly recommend. So it's really good for a lot of reasons, because it makes them experientially go to the right place to get what they need to get, and then hash through trying to find all those answers to keep up. So because of my experiences, that's, obviously that's one reason I'm really passionate about that on that front end of wanting them to know, like, here's what you exist under, and here's what you can avoid, to be able to continue a long career. So that's board rules and code of ethics. The cultural genogram that's there, I gave you the link. You can find it.
Where will it say who you supervise?
Who you supervise? If you go to, it says, I think licensee search is on the left side. Is that correct?
Like if you just
search for a licensee. Yeah. And then when you do search for a licensee, it takes you to the spot where you just say search for a licensee again, like it has a link. It makes it look like you have to log in, but you don't log in. You just go to print. It says a license certificate, and then you either look them up by the name or the organization.
I'm looking at yours, since I don't have anybody, it's not showing this,
Yes.
but I'd look yours up.
So you can look yourself up and see who's listed under you, or you can look them up to see if someone you're waiting on has gotten licensed yet or not, and make sure that you know who's under you. Yes.
So you have 4 people that show under you.
Right now, yes, because one is under another license. So that is number 5. Let me think. Yes. And number 6 is starting within the next few weeks. We just turned in paperwork. So that would be correct. Yes. I'm like, let me think. Is that right? Yes.
You have to look yourself up often and see.
I do. I do
sure.
look myself up often. Yes. I think, and that's something that's really important. You know, if you're not leading a training or it's something you wouldn't think about on a regular basis, I'd highly recommend it. On the LPC side, it's helpful because they'll have all the sites listed. You know immediately when a site is taken off and when one is added. You know immediately when their intern license is effective. The LMFT side does not do that. They don't list the sites. And so you don't know when was it active, when is it taken down. Is the other one active already? The associate is getting the information, but we're not necessarily getting the information. It's quite a bit trickier. If you have questions, you can always email the board. I think they're most responsive right now. My experience has been by doing that. But it has to be something like that. It has to be about paperwork or a very specific rule that is black and white, and the board would say that none of them are black and white. So if you ask a question, like, do I have to do a certain training? They're probably not really going to look for you specifically. If you said, how often do I have to do this type of training if I'm a supervisor, they probably would answer that because that's in the rules and it's more clear. But I had somebody say that they had emailed them and said, how does the board respond to psychotherapy notes versus clinical notes? They're not going to respond to that because becomes a court issue of the hidden notes that were just for you, and you can find, many different opinions on that topic. They are not going to answer that question. So I just very clearly said, they're not going to answer a question like that because they don't want to be held accountable, and I understand that, too. It's just something they said through email. Well, another part of it is the way the boards are set up, without it being like a paid job, on a regular basis that someone's doing, which is more what the licensing and regulation moving to that side would look like, is that when you're only meeting every 3 months and you can only get in, 10 to 15 complaints because they only have one day of those 3 that's designated to complaints. Even if they do have more than 2 investigators, there are more than that. But even with those more, yes, there are a lot of rules if you're looking at everything under Health and Human Services to keep up with. But they're also, how many are you really able to address every 3 months?
Right.
10 a time.
It's going to take you forever.
And there's 1,000. So if you put those numbers together, that's where the problems are coming from. So some of it is the way we have the board set up, where it can be, I talked to someone once, that was a board member, was like, tell me about that. Because at one time I was interested. Obviously, I'm very, and wanting to know about board rules and like being informed, and was interested in myself. And the answer to that was, it really helps if you donate to the governor's political campaign because it's appointed by the governor. So right now it's just become much more political and much more the title, and much less about actually how much they're accomplishing along the way is what I would say, for the profession. So it's not that I'm not saying everyone's heart is in the wrong place, but it's the way we haven't set it up to succeed. And it hasn't been set up that way for a long time. So it'll be interesting to see. So, we're taping this, but 2 years from now, we could be sitting in a whole different place, and there'll be a whole different plan because, as we know with government, you can always appeal and complain, and everything keeps shifting until they finally come up with a decision, kind of like the LMFT diagnosing decision has taken how many years now, to come about and finally get resolved. So there are always things in the works, but I just want you all to know, because you will need to stay up on it, because it will be important to convey that to a supervisee so that they know, what to be looking towards and what may be happening in the future, to be aware of. Yes. The cultural genogram, that link that I gave you for that one, it lets them create that 3-generation cultural genogram, and then it has some questions that they can pick from. For that, the questions and a lot of those things are all listed in that article, and so all you have to do is go to the link and you can see all of it. It's been helpful. Again, it lets you know some of the things that they may be coming into their internship with, that they personally have dealt with or are dealing with, without necessarily counseling them, because we're not supposed to be doing that, but hoping that you get some insight that way too. The Lars and the Real Girl movie is one I've used for a long time in the training specifically. One is a lot of people haven't seen it, and it has Ryan Gosling in it, and so they know him, but they just didn't see his early days. But the other is it brings up some great discussion about what exactly is this diagnosis and what could a treatment plan look like, and what were the ethical things in the movie. And it's nothing unethical to the point of lots of movies that show our field and portray it as being with every client in an intimate way and some of those types of things. So there's nothing unethical along those lines, but it brings up consent and some other things like that. So I like it because it lets you find out how much knowledge they have or how comfortable they are creating those things without it being a real person that they're working with as a client. So it makes it more comfortable, where they don't feel like they have to be the expert already because it's a movie. When I've used things like this, there was a vacation that I took. It was a little longer. I hadn't ever taken one quite that long. And so we needed to make up some time to be able to get the number of hours in the month that we're supposed to be getting. And so with that, I just made a 2-hour block on one end and a 2-hour block on the other end. And so it allowed us to do some videos and some other things from, a TBRI training. There are a lot of videos that we have. And so we were watching one of those and talking about attachment and bringing up some discussion. But this is another one that could be used where they could watch it together in supervision. It does count as supervision time and gives you some information that you could work with on the back end too. So it's just more laid back. So that would be an example of how to use it. They can also watch it on their own and bring the information back, but it's up to you, when you would want to fit something like that in. But that would be my recommendation. Along those lines of what I was just talking about, I do want you all to know that although in the board rules it says that it's an average of 4 times a month, when you sign the supervisory agreement form, it says that it's an hour a week. And so there's this misconception that people have, about, I could choose someone out of town and we could just meet for 4 hours once a month and just knock it out. But what happens is if you end up before the board and you have a complaint, is that is going to definitely count against you and not be something that they would promote. So our logs and things like that don't make it to the board unless there is a glitch of something that's happened, usually with paperwork, not usually a complaint. It's usually paperwork oriented, which then draws our logs in, which then they start finding out what we did or did not do that coincided. So I don't want to give you, the fear that every piece of what you've done for supervision hours goes before them, because it doesn't. But you also want to be really careful that you've done things in the most ethical way you can, so that if you're there defending a supervisee's rights and defending, your knowledge as a supervisor, that you have something to stand up against, instead of them being able to look at you and say, well, you signed this agreement saying you did this. Well, the board rules say that, and yes, they don't match, but they're not going to care at that point in time. A great example would be, I emailed one of the boards, not the LPC board, but one of the boards, it's been over a year ago. I had a supervisee and he was questioning, was like, well, the board rules say that we only have to meet every other week for an hour every other week. And I was thinking in my head, yes, but the board rules changed this last year, and now it says an hour every week, just like the LPC one does. And so I emailed the board and said, I'm confused. Your supervisory agreement form says an hour every week. The board rules say every other week. Is the form wrong? Are the rules like, where's the discrepancy? Because I needed to give them an answer. It was an important answer to get. And so they ended up saying, our form is out of date. Okay. Well, I happened to get on. It's not a license I go to all the time. So I happened to get on and look at it. It hasn't changed. It still says every other week. And it's been a year. And they admitted that it was out of date, that it hasn't been changed. And so that's where, as supervisors, I completely understand why there's some things that are very confusing that would lead us to have to go before the board, and which involves quite a bit of time and sacrifice and expense to get to Austin and staying around, and a lot of fear and anxiety of what's going to happen and what are they going to do, and what the ramifications would be. I can understand why it's confusing. And there's the other side from their standpoint of people are getting in trouble for the same things every single time we meet. Like, why can't we pull the profession together? Or why don't they get it? And it's because people aren't aware. They don't know. So some of it is completely being naive to things. Some of it may be intentional. I don't know. There's both sides to everything. But don't always trust. You're trying to just go with whatever the most strictest rule is that's there, go by that one, versus necessarily what you see somewhere else that may be a little bit more lenient, in one way or another. Because I'll be honest, they're not matching. They don't match on either, for either of the boards right now necessarily. And so I don't know why that hasn't been changed. I am not, I realize there's a huge perspective that's there. I have a small one. There's all kinds of other things that come into play with all of that. So you can use some things like the movie to make up and, yes, get your 4 hours in for the month. Just know on a regular basis you need to be doing it an hour every week to show you've been doing due diligence, as a supervisor. The activity 13 is the complaints against licensees. And that's the one where you have them go onto the board website and they're actually looking up what are complaints that people have had. You can see all the supervisors that have gotten into trouble. You can see all the licensees, that have gotten into trouble and had one. You can see what the consequence was. So it even lets you know. But it's good for them to be aware and to stay in the know, so that they're definitely trying to protect themselves. The thinking bubble math is one that I enjoy using to help them get more insight, or if they feel like they're stuck with a client. What it does is you start out, and I've got a diagram picture of it on the other side. I am not completely IT oriented, so that is my copy and paste from the internet of what it looks like. So you start out in the middle bubble, you're just filling out what it is that they came in for. So, we all know, like, presenting problem may be very different than a lot of other things that are there because there's a lot underneath that. It's the tip of the iceberg. So I have them put that in the middle, and then I have them be able to map out, well, what other information have you gained? Did you ask about, like, medical history? Have you asked about family history? Have you asked about whatever it is? Like, what have you gotten information on? And the other option is that it can keep going from that. So if you put medical, okay, then there's a history of seizures and of depression in the family. Okay, who was that with? Well, that was with this person and with this person, and they were on medication or they weren't, or here's how it was treated. So you could keep digging a little bit further, and it helps them learn the skills that they need, instead of asking about 10 different things in one session that aren't joined together. It lets them ask about maybe one and try to dig deeper to get more information to find out, is this a root cause of what's going on, or is it not, or is there another root cause? And it could be several, but that's one, it's a diagram that I like to use on a regular basis. Journaling the difficult client is just over a period of a month. They're looking at any transference, like countertransference, just uncomfortable feelings or mannerisms they see with someone that is difficult for them to work with. So they're just tracking, for you, to be able to find out in supervision why some of these things may be happening. Like, they don't know why they're stuck. They don't know why they're struggling with this client. And you're just having them map some things out. So by the time that they come, they can explain those more clearly, and you may be able to find some patterns, or some themes in the process.
Can I ask a question about
Yes.
that? Is that kind of protected by supervision, or does that become part of the client record? Like, how do you kind of keep that from being like a psychotherapy note?
When they're mapping things like that out.
Or when they're journaling, yeah.
Yeah. Journaling, when I say journal, I mean that super loose. So it's kind of like with a client, I have to explain, I don't want to know what time you got up that day and that you took a shower and what you ate for breakfast. Like, it's not a journal like that. If they're eating disorder, I guess it could look like that, but that's not what I see people for. So when I say journal, it's more like, a mannerism they saw, like, whether the client is squirming or whether they're like scooting in the couch, or they're sitting in the same spot, or they closed off, what are the mannerisms that they're seeing with this person that they feel stuck with. Basically, it ends up being resistance that is happening. I mean, our most difficult clients would be the ones we say are not making progress or are more resistant from our viewpoint, whether that's because of us or because of them. So it's not necessarily like the name and every detail about them. This is more like what they're able to recognize from the session itself. So even transference and countertransference, I know I've had a client, I was talking about it with the supervisee yesterday. It's probably one of the harder ones that I've seen. Still, I mean, there are other issues involved. I still can't pinpoint everything. But in the midst of that, as a teen, we started talking on topics, and it would be fine. Like, it was just like talking to anyone else, any other client. But the minute that it was said, well, I snuck out of the house, and went with my friend, or I went with my friend to the movie, but really it's not my friend, it's my girlfriend, but I haven't told my parents that. And so the minute I would try to very gently, because I knew this client, be able to say, well, what's keeping you from talking to your parents about it, or how would they respond if they knew? And this set of parents was not a set of parents that would have overreacted. That's the different thing about this one. Some parents, would have completely overreacted. They know nothing about the situation that their child's, the choices that they're making or why they would choose those, and they're completely against them. This set of parents was very open. And so it was more about just trying to keep things as private as possible, and I don't want to share it. And so the minute it was shared and I would try to give a little bit, I mean, it was like this unleashing, that would happen, attack that would happen towards me. So it was really good to talk to the supervisee about when they were asking about resistance. And I was like, some of that, I really struggled with, because obviously the approach, there was a lot of anxiety. Obviously, I knew that the client had. I was trying very hard to use some different approaches, and how we would bring some topics up, and trying to be, as indirect as I could, but still, give some insight. But it just, no matter what approach I took, the minute I was giving something that was a little bit different, they immediately felt attacked and that I was against them. And I knew that just because that's how I felt, because it all came back towards me, which I don't have many teenagers that it's quite like this situation was. And so with that one, that resistance, I could have been tagging down, like, this is the reaction, this is what was said to me, here's how I responded, and then be able to take it to supervision and say, what can I do differently? It's not a word for word of the session, because no one ever remembers everything from the session, especially when we're talking about it afterwards if it's not videotaped. But like, here was my perception of what was said and what was done, and really having them look at themselves. Is there something from my past and relationships that's inhibiting this or keeping it from moving forward? Because there are those two different sides to resistance, and one would say, well, it's the client and it's because of shame or transference or anxiety, or these different criteria that we know can allow for resistance, which, by the way, are the same ones that impact supervision and impact the supervision relationship. Or you can look at resistance from the side of, I'm obviously not really doing what I need to do to be able to help this client. And with that client in particular, I was able to share with the supervisee and go back to talking about attachment, because it was very different in that the father was the one that was really promoting counseling, and the mother came the first time, but she was completely against it, felt like it wasn't going to do any good, wasn't going to help at all, and had a very tense relationship with the daughter, And so that ended up being our relationship in counseling. But there was this lot bigger picture, and I knew some of it, but with the client who's 15, like how much can I really accomplish on being able to help them have that perspective and understand how they feel. So that was part of the secrecy of, I'm going to bring something up, and it's like my supervisee that I told you I'm going to get condemned or judged, and so then I'm just not saying anything, and I'll just like move on. And so it was just very difficult counseling, parenting, anything. And they did come in with a suicide risk. And so that's in the back of my mind too of, this is someone you're never really going to know whether they are or not, because they're going to hold in the plan and not, there's no, unlike other teens, there's no attention seeking ways to let you know what's going on, to try to prevent it. So that was when I really struggled with, and I was able to share that, and walk them through that. Which does bring up with supervision too, when I'm with clients, because of what I experienced in my early experiences, I tend to go a different direction of not using self-disclosure, very often at all with clients. Just because I'm letting it be focused on them. It might be enough to say, this is a hard journey, and I've been on something similar to it before. I have some clients that I will talk about things more personal. It depends on where perspective they're coming from, what they're wanting, their values, different things like that. But there are others that may never know a lot at all. And that's the hugest difference with supervision that makes, can really impact them, is being able to self-disclose on a continual basis when you're meeting. Like, they're talking about a client they're struggling with. Well, yeah, like here's a client that I just had. Here's what I did with them. Is there anything from that you could carry over? Or, yes, I struggle with this too. Or, what would you do if this happened? I had a 12-year-old who held a stuffed animal in front of their face for 40 minutes, this week. Like, what would you do if they refused to speak to you? And, you're just getting started out. Like, what would your response be? So it allows them to think through and hopefully learn from some of your experiences and skills that you've been able to get through the years through that self-disclosure, at the same time. The activity 16, the SRS and ORS, is one that's a free one that's online. It's the session rating scale and the outcome rating scale. The way that those are used is it's a Likert scale. You use it in session, is usually what I recommend if you're going to do that session rating scale. And then the client just walks through. It's like 5 questions. They Likert scale it. You just mark it on, a sheet and be able to go from there. You could have them bringing some of those in to talk through it. The difficulty becomes it's their client. How honest is their client going to be about how beneficial the session was that day, or if it wasn't? So with anything, there are pros and cons. And with the outcome rating scale, how are you going to be able to get that information? How many clients really get, maybe you're in an agency and you do a set number, and so a lot of people finish, they finish. They're not truly done with all their stuff, but they've done their 6 sessions. But for those of us who aren't in a situation like that, how many clients truly have a termination session, I think is pretty rare. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard to get the outcome rating scale. You could mail it out, and exactly how many people are going to return, that's probably 1 in 100, as you know. So it's the dynamics of using it could be harder, but it could be good for a supervisee to use on a regular basis, because they could even say with a client, I was thinking today we didn't make quite as much progress. I would have put us more like at a 2, so that's interesting. You felt like we were at a 4, and that way they're even rating themselves to some degree. Not that they're, saying that they're not professional enough or that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing as a counselor, but they're also able to put the client at ease to be able to truly let them know what they need from a session. 17 is the 6-stage model of change, and that is the one that's on, I've got it on the next page listed out. A lot of them have learned this through school. For some of us, maybe it wasn't around yet when we were in school, but they use the language a lot, and so I put it in there just in case you forget what the stages are. It's good for them to recognize their clients when they're starting. I'd say, well, which stage do you think they're at as they're starting with someone new? And it may be someone who's completely in that pre-contemplation. They're not invested yet. They're not committed. They're just shopping around, as we like to say. So they could use that. So you could ask about, the treatment plan, the diagnosis, and the stage all at the same time as they're presenting a new case to you, and get started with that. The self-care, self-reflection article is the one right after that. So for me, it's on page 17. That one's a good one. Just to give at some point in time, it really has to do with self-awareness. And in a session, how much more they're thinking about themselves, or how much more they find themselves checking out or being present or feeling overwhelmed or whatever might be going on for them, and being able to recognize that. And then it has those tools for self-care at the bottom that they might want to incorporate, or maybe you need to give them some of yours that you've learned through the years to be able to help them as they're starting to work with clients. It's hard, as we know, for people brand new in the field without experience. They're taking that stuff home with them and they don't know how to disconnect yet. And so being able to talk through what that looks like, how to still be engaged with the client but not to hold it personally, is helpful for them to know. And then encouraging motivation to change. Am I doing this right? That's the reminder card that's out there, just the motivational interviewing and being able to, hold yourself in check. So it could be good for them walking out of a session to be able to look through, okay, did I listen more than I talked? Did I encourage them, to talk about his or her reasons for not changing? Like, am I forcing change, or those types of different things. The supervisee that I had yesterday, where I've talked about there's not quite as much insight, and this would be a great example. So early on when we started, I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out how to navigate giving some constructive criticism, but there just wasn't a lot of teachability. And so I would say things, but I think it was just kind of over, the head and didn't really sink in. So we have done some things since then. I do think there's a little more insight, but we started out, he's describing a client, he's sitting with the client. It is an addiction situation, and he, was disagreeing with keeping, I would say disagreeing. He wasn't arguing, but like he disagreed with a client having a certain app on his phone that was going to be a huge temptation, for him, and has been in the past for many, many years, not just like, hey, I've been having a problem for 3 months kind of thing. And so the client was coming from the standpoint of, well, I feel like by having it on my phone and not going to it that I'm proving that I'm in recovery and that, I'm doing well, and it makes me, basically I feel powerful. And the route that the supervisee went with that first step, that goes along with addiction, which is the powerlessness. And that's a very knowledge thing. And they were both males. And so he went the direction of giving some analogies, which I think is not a bad thing. And I think men respond to those quite a bit, and I wish I could come up with analogies more. That's something I'm not as great at doing. And he gave an analogy, and his, first one he came up with, well, do you have this app on your phone? And it was an app that doesn't really matter a whole lot. And it was like, well, no. It's like, well, why do you not have that? Because I don't need it. Okay. So, trying to give some insight into, well, why do you need this one? That's a source of huge temptation. Yeah. And people contacting you for something specifically, you don't need it. So I like the analogy. I mean, I felt like that was, it made sense to me. He came up with it on the fly. Sounded great. But then as he continued talking about working with the client, he gave me 4 analogies. So basically he gave, kind of an analogy. The client responded the same way. Well, I feel like I'm powerful. It makes me feel like I'm doing it. Gave another analogy, same response. Gave another analogy, same response. Gave another analogy, same response. But he's talking to me about, the client just not having insight, and, he was saying to the client, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over. He was saying all these things with the client, which it's good. I mean, I'm not against that. But basically, it was a tug of war, and I could feel it when he was describing it. I mean, I could tell what this session was like, that there's not a lot of insight. It's not intentional. I mean, he's got a great heart. There's just not a lot of insight. And so, so I just made one statement, and I said, do you think you were working harder than the client? I already knew the answer, but I just asked it. And it was like, well, no. I mean, immediately, well, no. and so then just kind of sits and is thinking, is like, well, and I said, you just gave me 4 different analogies and you were getting the same answer for every single one. I said, the struggle is, and this is one of those that has done all this continuing ed and training and all these different things, is that you do have a lot of knowledge. There's a wealth of knowledge and facts and information, and rationally that doesn't make sense. But everyone does what makes sense to them. Even someone who we would say is insane. They all do. And that makes sense to him. Like, he told you 4 times. It made sense to him and said it over and over and over. I said, did you happen, he did end up bringing in, what is a successful life to you? And so the client ended up saying, well, happy marriage, happy life kind of thing. And okay. But instead of using that as a tool, he went with, something like, so that app, does it fit within that category? So I brought up and I was like, what if you said, oh, okay, like maybe I've misunderstood, so this is your main priority. So you and your wife have talked about it and she's supportive of you having this app. Like maybe I'm not understanding. Well, we all know the answer to that is no, but you're going in with that one down of being able to bring up what he's saying his priority is, but bring it into real life of how you're saying this is your priority, but it's not matching what you're doing. And that's the exact same problem that I have with the supervisee all the time, is what he thinks he's doing and what he's actually doing are actually very different things. And the struggle that's there. And then I also brought in, there are very few people that can commit to something and really follow through and not have those relapse moments. Tell me about some other times in your life that you have really committed to something and you saw yourself not falter at all, and stick with that plan. Like, have him convince you. So I just was giving like some backdoor, not, but we're butting heads here and I'm going to keep saying the same thing and you're going to keep saying the same thing and we're not making any movement. And yes, you're working harder than the client because he's convinced, of what he's doing and it makes sense to him, and you need to acknowledge that. So I do think there was some insight by the time that supervision ended, that it has taken years to get even to that point of me being able to have enough ground to even do that. It's not an unethical piece. It's just, is it a matter, it's not going to work in a lot of settings. And with addiction, we already know that there's that tendency to fall out very quickly. But I just came out and said, if I'm sitting in a first session and I have had a problem for 20 years and it's pretty bad, I mean, it's very severe. I'm doing the assessments, you're seeing it's an extreme situation that is impacting every area of my life. But I'm finally in counseling and I'm sitting with you and I'm here and your statement to me is, well, the road to recovery really takes 3 to 5 years. What is going to be my response at that time? Like, what is their response to that? And it kind of sat and thought, and I was like, I'm really encouraged. I made it 1 day or 1 week, and I think I'm doing great. But I'm hearing 3 to 5 years. I'm probably not going to listen to a whole lot else because I'm thinking, well, I can beat those odds, or I'm thinking, well, forget it. I'll just go back. What's the point of trying? So, I mean, it's not helping. You can have that knowledge, but you have to think through, like, how does it make sense that that's really going to help that client have that knowledge? Now, if they've been in for a year and they relapsed once and they're beating themselves up, and you're trying to give them encouragement and support, like, hey, this happens to most of us, and most people I work with have been here. But the truth is, it is like a 3-year process. And, don't give up now, because you've still got plenty of time to be able to continue on that road, to recovery and be able to get to that finish line. That would be an appropriate time to use it. And a first session may not be the most appropriate time. So that would be some examples of, how using this reminder card, I would hope that it would help. I have not used it with him specifically yet, but because there's that lack of insight, I don't think it probably would help, because I think the answers would be like, yeah, I did that. No, I didn't do that. Yes, I did that. No, I didn't do that. For somebody who has a little more insight, I think you could give this and it would be helpful, but honestly, they're probably going to be doing most of it anyway because they have some insight and they know, what's going to be helpful with a client. But you're just trying, all you can do is present different things and hope that eventually like something clicks, or they're able to get something. The next page is the play therapy one. So if you work in the realm of play therapy and in that world and have, the interns and associates, there is the play therapist. Ask yourself, one question that comes up a lot is, do you allow someone to work on the licensures and, the registered play therapist and, all these different things at one time? And I think my perspective on that has changed, over time as we're talking about. But supervision itself for the board and an internship, it's like trying to teach about private practice on the side. If all they were doing was play, and I had that opportunity, to take them in the playroom each time, and I'm actually working on a training that's as structured as this one. That would be for play therapy since that association requires their own. So maybe at some point in time I would finish that. But right now it's so difficult to bring in all the things that they need to be able to account supervision for both, that I'm landing on that side of just saying you need to finish your internship, and then if you decide you want to pursue that supervision, it is a lot less supervision. Maybe we would count some of what we've done, but a majority of it I would want them to be doing where we're only talking about play therapy clients and we're able to do some experiential things, or they're showing more video or something, along the lines of working towards the RPT versus trying to, again, do it all at once and work towards specializations and certifications that they don't even know what they're going to end up doing in the end. So something to keep in mind. So those are some tools there that I've given you. Activity 21 is the leads with interpersonal process recall. That would be in school, it was when you stop the videotape and they're asking questions. But what I do is the best way to use it would be to pick one section and you're having them use that first session that they were in and answer those questions. So you could use it. I've given you, this one has 6 different categories that you could be looking at. And so what I usually recommend is if you want to do the unstated agendas, then I'll hand this to them just like it is and say, by the next time we meet, I want you to consider one of the sessions that you've done and be able to look at the unstated agendas and answer those questions when we meet in supervision. And that has given them some insight and been helpful. And several of them have said, these are questions I even want to use with clients. Like, it's given them a broader, view of questions they could be asking, what they could be doing, how they could be helping clients. I think most of them were doing it. Could have been the expectations and cognitive examination are the ones that they've chosen. And I haven't done all 6 of them with any one person yet. To be able to say every category, but I do like that one, and that one has been helpful as well. So the factors that predict alliance are style and power, and when it has the power that's listed there, there's that expert power base, which is having knowledge and expertise that I have that hopefully they don't have, and that's why they're under my supervision. And there's referent, and that's the supervisee seeing themselves as similar. The way that referent power takes place is that you're doing that self-disclosure on a regular basis. The position power is where they're viewing you as being in a more powerful position by licensure. And the way that takes place on a weekly supervision session is you're signing off on their log every week. So you just make sure you're doing that weekly. And the knowledge power is questionable, because I've had people that have had like an LCDC license for 20 years and they decide to come to me to work on the LPC. They have way more knowledge and experience. I don't specialize in addiction than I am ever going to have. They know way more people, have way more resources. And so that was really, we started out some in the consulting phase because I was learning as much from them as they were from me. They were wanting to broaden the populations they were working with, and that's part of getting the other licensure. But I knew that they had way more when it came to addiction treatment and helping than I was ever going to have. The other things that impact alliance are attachment style, Supervision can be like parenting, is what I wrote under that. The evaluative practices, and then ethical behavior. So I gave you creating a safe environment for supervision, which are a lot of the things that we've been talking about here. So it's trying to normalize mistakes, and you recognize their strengths, and being able to work through, some things that they may need to. And the factors that affect alliance are the ones that we talked about a minute ago. It's the same thing, resistance with clients. It's the resistance and attachment, shame, anxiety, and transference. So do you have any questions about any of that specifically? That gives you plenty of options, to choose from as they're waiting to start supervision with you, or after they have started, or in some gaps that you might have, or some things that might be helpful to do. So why don't you tag down, if you'll just write down in your manual, what are a couple of things that you can take from everything we've just talked about this morning and start implementing, or that you want to make sure that you implement that you didn't know before you got here, or you weren't doing before you got here. We'll go through models, and we're just going to breeze through the models piece to then get into the ethics side. The models, I've just given you the two that are the non-theory based models. So there's this theory side of models, which when you went through your training you probably found out about, and then there's the non-theory side. So just a refresher on that, there's the developmental approaches that are to supervision, and then the second side is the social role. So those are the two options when you go with non-theory based. So under developmental, I've got some of those, and there's the stage developmental model, which is often known as IDM. It's the integrated developmental model. It has 8 domains that go with it, and I do like what those domains are. I think they are important things to cover with the supervisee. And then what happens is when you turn the page, they also have levels. So not only do you have the 8 domains, but then you're also having the levels that they might be at also along with that. It's looking at it, because it's developmental, it's looking at it on a continuum. So a supervisee starts out at a certain point, and then the goal is to get them to the ending point. And so the levels are viewing it that way. Level 2 is the one which would be more like an adolescent. And so that's some of the counselor role, if you're looking at it from social role, of them getting some insight. So they start out at the very beginning, and then they move into where they can pick some things themselves, and they're very confident, but then they're also needing help, and they're dependent. So it's a turbulent stage. And then level 3 is when they're focusing on a more personalized approach. And then they have the level 3 integrated, is what they call it. So if you wanted to incorporate some things from IDM, you could show the supervisee these levels and say, here's what we're trying to work through, while you're in supervision. This is really the supervision model that I use, because they have no clue that supervision models exist. They get out of school and only know about the models they have learned about. So you could give them even a bigger perspective on what you're using and what you're watching for as you go along. The Heron model, what happens is someone breaks off, they create a little bit of it that's a little bit different in one way or another, and they can put their own name on it. You know how that works. And so with Heron, he just ended up coming up with some different interventions along with the levels and the 8 domains. And so the interventions, there's the facilitative one, and it says the client and the supervisee maintain control. So it's cathartic and catalytic and supportive. And then there's the authoritative ones, where the control is between the therapist, with the therapist, or it's with the supervisor. And so it could be prescriptive, informative, or confronting. So what I was describing earlier that I was doing with my supervisee yesterday was more in that authoritative. If I went with the facilitative and just trying to see if there could be some gaining of insight by me just asking some questions and some different things, in the past that wouldn't have worked, but we were attempting, and it was working to some degree yesterday. But I have to tend to go more authoritative. So it's the difference. The process developmental models are different, because those are looking at, like the reflective one that's there is looking at some kind of trigger event that happens that a supervisee identifies. So this would be a lot like case consultation. Something happens that week in a session, I'm bringing it to you in supervision. It's a trigger event, is what we'll call it. And then the reaction is the skills or strategies, personhood issues, conceptualization that they have. And so what you're trying to do is reevaluate skills and knowledge and give them a new perspective on how they could handle it. So all of these still use the levels, still use their domains. They're just adding on some other, factors to consider when you're doing the supervision piece. Logan, Bill Hardy, and Delworth changed it in that they made it cyclical. So with all of these others, the supervisee starts over here. We're seeing where they're at on the continuum. The goal is to get them to the end. But you have these 8 domains. And so the way that they would look at it, they ended up renaming them. And so they call it 3 stages with 8 issues. Instead of 3 levels with 8 domains, it's 3 stages with 8 issues. So they changed it enough, to put their name on it. But what they did is they are a little bit different, the issues versus the domains that we were looking at, but there's some similarities. But what they would say is that you're looking at each of those issues and seeing what level are they at. And it can have this cyclical feel to it, and that, yes, they may have learned everything they needed in this area, but we may be starting from scratch in this area because we haven't worked on that one yet. So it's more like a grief cycle of being cyclical, and you can go back through, the different levels, stages, however you want to look at it, as you go along. And so that's the spin with that one if you decided to incorporate it. The stages, they just rename them, so they're a little bit different. It's stagnation, confusion, and integration. And then there's the event-based supervision, which is similar to what we were just looking at with the trigger event. And this one, it can be identified by either one, but the focus is on the events of the supervisee's work with the supervisor handling of events as they occur. And so this one, instead of focusing on one trigger event from a session, it's coming up with, here are 7 things that you're probably going to deal with at some point in time during your internship. And so these are things that we need to address in supervision. It says the end point is an increase or a decrease in one or more of knowledge, skills, self-awareness, and alliance. So as you go through looking at those 7 events and how to handle them and what to do with them, you should be accomplishing one of those ending points every time you're going through a discussion on one. And that's the goal. So is that clear? Are you understanding? Okay, the models and how you could use them. That last one is the lifespan one. I do like it. I think that there's some truth to it if you look through it and you've been in the field a while, where you can see yourself as you progress through different phases. The struggle is it doesn't have a lot of validity and reliability. They just sent out 100 interviews. It was whoever, they did the interviews and whoever responded or was willing to be interviewed. So it just doesn't have the same research backing to it. These other models on the front end that are developmental ones, IDM and reflective and the Logan, Bill Hardy, and Delworth, those have had some more research with them. But I think most of us would agree. I couldn't tell you what model my professor was using in school. They never said, here's the model that we were using while you were a student. Probably because they felt like we had enough on our plates to try to handle and grasp at that point in time. So it's your decision if you want to be able to give that perspective to a supervisee to see there is another side to things, that's even bigger than just counseling. That comes with supervision. That one is a little harder. The last one we were looking at, the lifespan developmental, because it has the 14 themes, and I can't memorize all of those, so you may be better than I am and have time to do that. So it is a little trickier. I'd have to keep it in front of me all the time. I can't just memorize it and be able to explain it to a supervisee without looking at it. I'd have to give it to them. So that's developmental. That other side, we were talking about the second set of non-theory based models, and those are social role. Bernard and Goodyear is the first one that's listed. Remember that they're the founding fathers of supervision. So we think of our field sometimes as having been around a really long time, but really the boards have only been around since the 80s, somewhere in there. And supervision came after the boards were developed. And so most people, there are still people around who have licensure that will say, I was just grandfathered in. I hear things like that at different points in time. They didn't have a lot of rules back then. And so they could be grandfathered in or become supervisors. So that's another, way that they got into the field and continued in the field. So you could give a whole other perspective, on developmental and on social role, depending on what you wanted to choose. So with Bernard and Goodyear being founding fathers and recognizing how long it's really been around, supervision itself, they just have the 3 different types of skills. It's intervention, conceptualization, and personalization. And you're trying to look at what role you're in as a supervisor, as in teacher, counselor, or consultant, when you're working on those different skills. And so you're paying attention to both sides, not just the development of the supervisee, but now I'm coming into play as in what role I'm doing. And I should be able to walk away from a session and be able to say, this is the role, that I was using that day. And maybe I'm letting a supervisee know more about the discrimination model, and I'm letting them know, what role I'm using. With Hawkins and Showit, they had 2 different systems that they considered when it came to social role. And so there was the therapy system of the client and the counselor, and there's the supervisory system of the supervisor and the counselor. And they had different modes. So we've gone through domains and issues and levels and all, stages. And so this one they used modes instead. And it does have 7 different considerations to be able to be watching for on the supervisory relationship, the supervisor's own process, the relationship between the supervisor and the client that's really through the supervisee. It's not that I'm with the client and sitting with the client. And then there were 5 factors that they added in for their model. The SAS approach switched it and made them into functions. So instead of having 3 roles, there were functions. And there were 7 components to that. And then they had the 5 tasks that you're trying to help the supervisee accomplish or work towards or incorporate into supervision. And then they had what they called contextual factor components, and that just means the system, every person that's involved in the system. So where you're working, supervisor, supervisee, client, with the supervision relationship being the pillar. So those are social role approaches. And how you could incorporate it would be recognizing if you wanted to choose just one. And what I've done is we'll get to a page later on, and what I've chosen to do to this point is I've meshed together some, which is what I tend to do in counseling too. It's just there's not necessarily one true theory that I think should be used with everyone. And so you're just, using different things and tweaking and finding what works best. So I have tended to give, to mesh them together, and I've used one that I've given to supervisees. I don't use it every session, but I gave it to them just to give them, it was like one session where we kind of got a knowledge of supervision itself and what I'm looking for, and along with values clarification and all those other things that we're doing, it just gave them a little more insight. Do you have any other questions on how to incorporate a model or how to use it or why it's important to have one or if it's important or anything like that? Okay. So as you have more supervisees, I think you'll get some more footing into knowing what you want to incorporate, but some of it's just hard to pick when you haven't had enough experiences yet to know what you want to incorporate, and how you want to go about it. So I do look at it, supervisees, if they're wanting all theory when they come to me, I just tell them I'm really not the right person for you, because that's not something I do in every supervision session is, well, why don't you try this theory instead of this theory? And here are all the techniques that go with that one. It's more like they present an issue and we're talking about what they tried, and maybe I give them like 3 or 4 other options like I described to you earlier. Well, what if you had asked about his wife? And, like I misunderstood. That's a 1 down, try and take that approach. And then there was the other approach. Oh, you must have had a lot of things you've been able to be committed to, so it's, it's going from all different directions, but you're trying to find one that actually works. I think it's the same thing with a supervisee. It's not that you have to be tried and true, but I do want you to have an understanding, because I do think there's validity in these when we're looking at what are we really trying to accomplish by the end. Like what do they need to know? How do we know that they've made it, and how do I know I did my job, and that we were successful at it, other than they got to the end and counted their hours. So all of that incorporates how you could build that relationship and things you can do activity-wise or model-wise to give them a little bit more knowledge and background to be able to move through the process of supervision and hopefully navigate it well. The next part that we're going into has a lot more to do with just comprehensive supervision is what it's titled and what it's called. And then we'll get into some more of those ethical pieces as we go through today. For the comprehensive supervision, when it says how to determine who to supervise, these are some things that are really specific that I've just given you that I've learned over time that have helped me. So the first thing you have to do, a lot of people will find you by a website. When people ask, well, how do I get supervisees? Some of it is word of mouth. If you went on campuses, like once a semester and offered to do a talk about being in private practice, then you would have students that would approach you after that program because they would have seen you. Yes, you have to donate your time to make that happen, but that's another way that could be really beneficial to find them. It could be, if you have friends that are working at schools and you get in touch with whoever the internship practicum professor is and have them send people your direction. But for me, a big bulk of it is they find the website, or they find me. Sometimes they are actually pulling the roster off the website. They're going by zip code and finding who's in the zip code, and then they try to look them up and make a decision, based on website or whatever they make a decision on. So one thing I have to do is they email me first, and that's how it works for me. If you're in an agency, it's going to work completely different for you because they've already been selected for you. You know who you have, you know what direction you're going. When they email, I really have to make sure and find out if they're working on an internship that's for school or if it's an LPC internship. A majority of the schools are now calling their practicums internships. That is extremely confusing. And I've even there's a school nearby right now that I've had 3 students contact me from, and they're working on their bachelor's, but they're calling it an internship. And so they're saying, can I do an internship? And it took a few emails back and forth with the first one where I was like, I should have asked this on the front end. I forgot. And so having to say, what type of internship are you working on? Is this for your master's? Are we talking about an LPC internship? And they were saying, no, it's my bachelor's. I have to get some hours in. And I'm thinking, you can do that in an agency. It's not, there's too much time and effort and, sacrifice that would go into trying to do that internship here. So we'll really clarify that. It also says what's most important to me is to assess supervised activity. That's the main thing when I meet with them. Those are where all my questions center. Is who have you been supervised, by? What type of supervision did you have? Was it video? Was it, was it live? Was it, case consultation? What was it? So I know what they've had and what their experiences have been. The problem becomes that a lot of the schools now, there's only a couple to a few I can think of in my head right now of all the schools that are around here that actually have counseling centers on campus where they're actually doing some hours there. So when you're getting all of your practicum hours just out in the world, you have no clue what quality that person is getting. And you also have no clue what quality of the supervision that they're getting. Maybe they have a supervisor with school, but it's not every week. It was the supervisor that was there, and maybe that person cared about them, and maybe they didn't. You just don't really know. So that's why I start at those spots, because it lets me know how hard my job is going to be as I get started, and is this something that I want to take on based on what experiences they've had. So that's way more important to me even than schooling, how much theory they know. It's more important than a lot of things just for me, because I want to have that information and to know the background. It says, don't assume that their education came from a school that was a gatekeeper. That is very not the case these days. Schools exist because they make money from students. And there's also, lots of lawsuits, as we know, about complaints in our field that take place on a regular basis. I did have, it was the worst absolute interview that I have ever done with a supervisor. It was really not that long ago. It was a few months ago. And it was definitely the most chaotic situation I've ever been in. It was someone that had come through a training that referred a friend, is what they had said through email. And I didn't know that I even had the ability to take them on, but I was just meeting with them, and I thought, well, maybe I can point them in the right direction. I'm sacrificing some time, but I'll do that. And so they walked in, and they ended up, it was one of those things, they ended up sitting in my chair, which I'm not all about, like my chair, but there's 2 couches in my office, and then there's the chair I sit in. It's pretty evident, like, where I sit. It's a no-brainer. It's not like 3, like a big overstuffed chair and 2 couches. It's obvious. And so they sat in my chair and started rocking, like in my chair. And so I'm kind of standing there thinking, okay, we'll go with some play language and see what I can accomplish, And so I walk up and I was like, oh, you're sitting in my chair. That's, and I'm not saying it in a derogatory, sarcastic way. I was just like, oh, you're sitting in my chair. Well, she continued, like rocking, like stared at me and just like kept going. I was like, oh, you think it's okay to keep sitting here, while we're about to meet, kind of thing. So eventually she like huffed and got up and like plopped herself, down on the couch so I could sit in my chair. Not that I'm sole owner of everything. So I'm sitting there, but I knew very clearly I'm going to have to set, the power differential very quickly, because it wasn't just like a naiveness or like a cultural issue, or it wasn't any of that. And so it was different. So we start, talking, and I very quickly was getting very scared and anxious as I was finding out that she supposedly had been under supervision. I want to say it had been for 1.5 years, but it had 3 supervisors, and I think maybe had done 3 months worth of supervision, like maybe. I was having a hard time. I don't think there was a full even knowledge, because it had been so sporadic. So there was no an hour a week with anyone. And I'm really scared at this point. She hasn't even seen her current supervisor in, I think it had been 6 months. So anytime there was a job loss, she just quit going, because she thought, I don't have a side, I'm not getting hours, so I don't have to go. It's that whole misconception about what supervision is and how it works. And so she would just drop off, and I guess the supervisor didn't care, I don't know, what was going on. So I'm just viewing like nightmare, like waiting to happen all over this. So I'm just kind of thinking through it, and I was like, well, I'd really contact the board, and at this point I'm concerned just about your hours and them being able to count and who you're under and those types of things. And so there was this very adamant piece that came out of, well, this is just like school, and everything's always like this, or something to that degree. And I thought, oh, I'm going to take this loophole. so I kind of, jumped through to find out, and I was like, well, what happened while you were in school? Tell me about school, kind of situation. And it immediately came out, well, they, wouldn't let me be myself. And from the very beginning, tried to get me to be someone else, like this cookie cutter, as they described, therapist, I guess. And so, and it was really interesting because the friend had sent the reference questions, and it referenced more, does have difficulty stating things that are inappropriate in situations, like being too direct, I guess, but it wasn't a positive review. So I realized very quickly, maybe this friendship isn't so solid. And so I did get those before I met with them. So I was getting all this information, and sure enough, like it even got to a point, it really sounded like, the president, maybe the deans, all these people met together with this person, and basically it was like a lawsuit that was probably being threatened. And so she got through, like she graduated and has her degree and was able to finish. But from the very beginning, I would say there's probably diagnosis worthy something, or pattern behavior, something going on that's a little bit wrong, or needs to be dealt with, we'll say. And so from that situation, don't assume that a school was a gatekeeper. I say that all the time, but I hadn't had an experience quite like that one. where it was even worse than working with a client, just sitting for an hour. And so I just, just definitely had to recognize and backtrack, and it backs up the things, that we talk about in here and why it's so important to do them, along the way. So I'm guessing she got credit for the hours she had done, even though her supervision was minimal. And, that's scary to me. Like, that's a public client welfare issue, that's probably waiting to happen in some way, shape, or form. I mean, something. I don't know what. So ask that. The other is clarifying what their school counted as direct hours. For some of the schools, a practicum, they can do direct hours that involve, even filing or sitting in a session or, leading sessions, yes. There are other schools, some of the online schools have gotten so strict just for reputation that the only thing that counts is actually leading it. And the problem with that becomes that then they've never actually seen an expert doing it. So if in your practicum you were never seeing a counselor who's actually in the field and doing it on a regular basis, and the only thing you can count is leading it, and maybe there's not someone sitting in all the time because of the agency that you're at, and then you're adding in that some of these programs, especially the online ones, the number of hours that they have to get, it's pretty astronomical. It's way higher than the normal expectation of especially what's expected by the board. A lot of schools may require a little bit more. So you for sure can count things, and you have a little overage, when you are trying to get your intern license. But for these, it's gotten very high for some of them. And so these students, are really struggling with trying to get the hours that they need and trying to get it direct hours where they're leading it. And that's a concern for me too. So it goes back to the assumptions. You may think something sounds really great. Oh, like a supervisee wanting to get continuing education, like that's awesome. But then there's like the side of the extreme, and then there's the side of, oh, they've done all their hours direct, and they were leading it. That's great. But then there's the side of, have they really seen anyone do it well? I don't know. It's a field where you have to learn by having had really good supervision, watching over all the hours that you're doing, or something to back it up. It says, find out if they've been through counseling before as a client. A lot of the schools are not requiring counseling anymore. We've had some supervisees even come through that were supervising on the outside. I know of one particularly right now that had approached me, but I passed them off to someone else, and I've had to talk to that supervisor before. It's not been an easy supervision, process. And apparently there's like the reaction in supervision session to things that are brought up. There's not always a positive response to those. And they were talking about going in the playroom to do some role play, and that supervisee was mortified. They've never done counseling. They've never dealt with their stuff. So like the thought of pretending to be the counselor while the supervisor is the client is mortifying. There's a huge insecurity that's there, which there should be some anxiety, and maybe you role play it the other way. I'll be the counselor and you be the client, act it out for me, give them some comfort level. But it's like a closed, shut down, I don't want to go into anything that would be personal, to me, because they still haven't dealt with it. So I'd be really leery about taking on someone without you can require them to do counseling, to be under your supervision. No one else is going to require it, but you could. The other says ensure the training site matches the interests and professional skill level. Wherever they're wanting to get their hours, you're trying to make sure you have some experience in that. When I have had people approach me back when I first got the supervisor license, the schools were hiring a lot of people that had just graduated. It wasn't under a school counselor position, but kind of a contract position that had a certain title. And a lot of them were contacting me. I'd had several. And I just was not comfortable taking them on. I've never worked in a school setting. I have no clue. The whole thing of like FERPA and HIPAA, and like they have a whole set of laws, and I don't even know what those are. It was just that. It was way too much, it felt like, for me to have to try to learn so early on when I didn't have a clue. And at this point, I still had some contact me, but I passed them to someone that I at least know was in a school setting at one point in time. They have some experience. They may not have done it long, but they have some knowledge, whereas I have no knowledge, other than the ones that we've had around here that have worked here. it says obtain written professional references, and I can't stress the importance of treating it like an interview process and making sure that you do those reference checks. I was talking with a couple of people lately that have some employees and contract people, and they both had some pretty negative experiences as of late, ones that you don't want to have and don't want to experience. They weren't even with interns, but they had not followed through on getting those reference checks done. It's not even a background check, it's just a reference, like sending it. I even email it. It doesn't even have that personal where I would kind of hear the response on the phone, which would be even better. But I'll send it by email, and I get the responses by email, and I just make sure I have 2. And if you'll do that for supervisees, as well as anyone you're considering having around you, I would highly recommend that. If it can be, if there's someone from school, I think that's fine, like a professor, but you want to try to have, if they only have school references, try to have one from the school and then one that's from another job, like a job outside of the field that they've had. Because what you're needing to know has more to do with, are they teachable? Are they going to, be able to do instruction? Are they just constantly somebody who battles, authority, and there's going to be a power struggle there? So that's why you would want someone outside of the field with, a professor. If they've been in the field for a while, yes, go ahead and use 2 people, from the field, because a professor doesn't really know you personally. They do, but they're not hunting down your Facebook page to see what you're doing, all hours, So it's a little more impersonal, and you're wanting someone who really knows them. There's question references and affiliated training programs about any known risks, and just wanting to make sure there's nothing that you need to know about before you take them on. For people who don't have a site, I really encourage them, if you're wanting to get that paperwork in and you're finding that no one is even looking at you because you don't have your intern license, which can happen. It's being in that black hole of, I've graduated, I passed my exam, but I can't find a job, and I can't, I need a license to back me. Then I say, start doing some volunteer hours somewhere. Have a site, something that we can write on the paper. We could send it off. I will warn you that could be a negative for you, because they may end up finding a site once they have their intern license that's not in something that you're familiar with, or they're going to get free supervision and you're going to have met with them, 2 times, and then they will, leave you, which that's fine. But know the risk, going into it, what can happen and what the outcome could be. And doing that, if you choose to take someone and put the volunteer hours on there without a full job that they have as a site. It says have them purchase the same liability insurance that you have, and the reason for that is if something goes wrong, it's like car insurance. If you're in a wreck, if you both have the same insurance, it's a lot easier to work through and to get that claim dealt with and to be able to get whatever reimbursement you need to get to fix your car than it is if it's 2 separate companies that are battling it out, and who's really responsible. Well, your person did this and your person did this and the cop said this and there's all these other he said, she said things going on. So if you can, you want to try to make sure that they can get that same type policy that you have. The other, it says if you own your own practice, and that's that piece, the minute an intern becomes licensed, or the minute you join with someone else who's licensed, and we were talking about if you're with other people, even if you're operating separately, really consider those group policies. It's not that malpractice is going to be there for you and be the net when, to catch you when something goes wrong. Unfortunately, I've known people that have been through some pretty devastating things, and it definitely doesn't live up to what we think it should be worth, in the end, and what it should. But it's still a matter of, did you do your part, your due diligence to try to protect yourself if you could. So remember that if anyone gets licensed, but while they're an intern, you're going to have your own, and it's fine. The education, training, and clinical experience is, who to choose just based on your initial impression. You can ask characteristics, so their educational background, their clinical competence, what they feel like they're really strong in, what they feel like they're weak in, and then there's the why they're in the field. Why did they make it here? So you could go into education, training, and clinical experience if you get that opportunity, but sometimes in that first time we're meeting together, I can only get through this top half of these questions that to me are more important than even the others. The previous supervision experiences, it's what we've talked about. Where were they at? How often were they receiving it? What type did they receive? The strengths and weaknesses as a therapist and a supervisee, confidence, level of development, all those types of things. The goals of supervision, you could use some of that values clarification, but just having them talk about what is their hope for where they want to be, 18 months, 2 years, however long it's going to be. Where do they want to be at that point, and what is going to make them feel like it's been, a successful learning experience for them? What is that end goal? The style and techniques goes back to the expectations and trying to allow for some growth. And then what I did was I gave you the reference request questions that I use, that I send off when I'm doing those. So I send it off to 3 people by email. So I ask for the email addresses, and then I require to receive it back from 2. So the things on there are the strengths and weaknesses, but it has the organizational skills, how they respond, are they a team player, what kind of relationships do they have with people. That lets you know even more about what their client relationship is going to be like and how they get along with others. Ethics, asking questions there, and then just anything else that they feel like you need to know. So I usually get good responses from these. In hiring processes, you can't even ask questions this specific, nowadays, the way that employment works. And so with supervision, I can still tend to ask a lot of these, and I'll get the responses, because it's not always about employment. Sometimes it's just supervision itself, and I'll get a lot more honesty. So that's a good thing. But if it is not a super glowing review, then it's something to consider, to reconsider whether you want to take it on. And the next 3 pages are full of all the sites that are in Dallas-Fort Worth that I know of right now. So if you know of another one, let me know. And living in a different place, I would highly recommend, if you end up supervising, that you end up creating some kind of grid similar, so that people know where they could go and where they could be able to gain some hours. So when someone contacts me and they say they want supervision and they don't have a site, I immediately send this. It's kind of like my gift to them. You took the step, you contacted me. And I just say, best thing for you to do is to find a site first, and then we can consider supervision after that. Or if you decide you want to do volunteer hours and you secure something like that, then contact me again. But it happens that I'll have a lot of people from out of town that end up contacting me one way or another. They'll find the website or something, or get referred in some way. Someone's like, this lady has a list, contact her. I don't know. But they'll end up contacting me. And so even licensed people from out of town, this is really helpful to them when they're moving from Abilene, Houston, Austin, wherever, and they just don't know where to start. And so if I am not the best place for them, but they tried to seek out employment here and I know we're not the best fit, then I give them the options, or when I have someone moving from out of town. So it at least gives them a start. So.
Do you ever, it kind of sounds like what you're describing, but I feel like I would always get a lot of calls right before a semester started from student interns, but even with kind of the entitled, I need an internship, how many hours can you give me? And I'd be like, who are you? Who are you calling me? Even that alone, I never had anything to offer anyway, but it was, that made me really hesitant that was sort of their approach. I couldn't tell if it was that they just weren't being better prepared.
Weren't trained on how to approach and what to ask, just how to be more professional.
But it worried me about what professionally they don't have the etiquette to really be doing that. I wouldn't want to be passing on clients to them.
Right.
Do you ever resist off of that kind of stuff alone, or are you?
Sure. For us, I think there are practicum students that contact us. I only chose to do it one time. It was I would say it was a successful, they did their practicum and their internships here, and that was all a success. I would say the negative is what you're mentioning right now, and that because this was the only realm that they had been in was private practice, is there was an entitlement by the end about what I deserve now that I'm at licensure, full licensure. Many of us hopefully were exposed to other things other than just, private practice. I did private practice from the start after I graduated, but I did several other things in my master's degree, and I was working several jobs while I was getting my hours so I could finish quickly in a year. Back then we could do it in a year. And so there's some parts of like needing to put in, to work in things that are not as glamorous, to then be able to work into other realms. So I have not chosen to do, that again. But the other reason I haven't is that when practicum students contact us, they're required by their schools to have a certain number of hours. And if you're not in a setting that can basically guarantee that number of hours, it's the same as the intern. So I take a different approach than other people do. But if I can't guarantee that they're going to be able to get that, then it's too much work on my part, because I'm going to want to ensure it. I'm going to feel like I committed to it. They've been here, they're trying to graduate, whatever's going on. And so I won't. With the, the interns, that are true LPC interns, yes, I talked about earlier, it goes into, I don't really take on people that I don't have the hours to give, because then that creates the tension between them of who got a new client and who didn't. And a lot of times and this is not true for everywhere, but a lot of schools, the professors that are there, some of them have never even done private practice. Maybe they worked in another realm and they just were hired on, or maybe they did do it, but now all they've done is teach for 10 years. There's that, it's a struggle, between trying to keep themselves in true counseling experience and just teaching all the time. It's a different world. And so I don't think that they have lists like this that they're even offering to try to help, to say, like, here are all the places you can go to. It's kind of like we're saying with interns who are fighting over, it's practicum students fighting over, who can get a site and where's it going to be and who can get there first. And there's a struggle. So, yeah, so that's on our part to try to give them the tools so they know the options that are there.
Here's one other thing that I saw recently with an employee was that she had done an out-of-state training program online. Mm-hmm. She submitted her transcript and got approval from the board to take the NCE, passed the test, and then when she went to apply for her internship, then they identified that she hadn't taken all of the required classes. So she had to go back and take like 3 graduate level classes, but she's already passed the test, which, like, now the test is kind of the gatekeeper of you've met the educate, all that stuff. So once you do it, then it's really seems like it's just about locking down the supervision agreement. And
that is really
that
interesting. It, so. That like we're talking about, the board is overloaded as it is. But
I'm glad they caught it, because if she hasn't taken the classes she did. Them, but
you thought it probably would have happened with the exam, though, because you can't take the exam. The only schools around here that I know, there's only a few that I know of where they can take the exam before they've graduated. But maybe she had graduated and was asking to take it. But usually you have to submit that stuff. Yeah. So I don't know how that would, take place, but that does happen.
It's pointing out to me and thinking about our commitments as supervisors, though, is maybe even that's worth looking at, because that could be you get strung along for another year.
Yes, waiting for them to get done. After you've already turned in some paperwork. That's very true.
So then they might get approved under you.
Yes, you have to watch. You better watch, because once they have that piece of paper, like, they can do whatever they want. She finally submitted it, obviously, and didn't let me know. There's no way for me to know unless I'm paying attention.
But that's also your biggest concern about this girl that hit long, and there are lots of biggest concerns, but the rocking in your chair.
Yes.
Is if she just stops showing up, we have to think about the fact that we're still listed as the supervisor, even though they're not coming.
Exactly.
And you can't just retract your name.
Right. Well, the things that you do is that you reach out to them. So, like I did with her, initially, but you could reach out, and say, we're required to do, like, okay, I'll give an example. This one, I totally did it unethically, so I can tell it anyway. But it was in my earlier days of supervision before I understood the rules and everything I was supposed to be doing. And so I had someone that was wanting a supervisor, but they wanted to pay me for individual supervision to get the quality supervision, in their words. And then on the every other weeks, they wanted to go to group. And there are some people in Fort Worth that do have a group. They're older men, and so it's very cheap to attend the group. They're not practicing anymore, if not very little. And when I say older, I mean older. And so, like, I have seen them in action. It's slow, the process. So I know, like, there's not a lot that's coming out of this group. And I thought this one was going to be no-brainer, like super easy. They already had one license. They were just wanting to get the other one. And they supervised people at their work, which was a counseling practice. So they had practicum students and intern students. And I'm like thinking, oh, like, this is going to be fine. Like, no issue, not a big deal at all. What ended up happening, the first time we were supposed to, so we sign on, the first time we were supposed to meet, like a family situation happened, something. So I, showed grace. It seemed valid enough. And it was real. It involved something with court kind of that happened overnight and a family member. So I allowed that and gave some grace. So they came, I think, for the next one. And for the one after that, they no-showed. So I sent an email like, hey, missed you today. We had a supervision session scheduled. Just checking, whatever. The email that came back was like, we must have miscommunicated. And I'm thinking in my head, well, I didn't miscommunicate. You may have miscommunicated, in some way. But there wasn't a lot of responsibility. And I specifically remember that line of, you must have miscommunicated. So, okay, so here's the next one. I'm like, I'm going to have to get firm here. Like, this isn't going well. And I have one right now that I'm going to have to get firm with, that we're just getting started. And I'm sensing a pattern of some struggles that are there. So in the next one, they came. We did meet. And I mean, this is only my maybe second or third time. Maybe we did the interview and this is my second true session or third. So we still haven't built enough rapport. I'm not using any of this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to build some rapport. So I don't think I addressed it completely, other than, and it was tricky because I did have in my contract they had to pay for it. But at the same time, they had asked me to come speak at their agency and were paying me out of their own pocket to do that. I didn't know that until I went. But the check was from them personally, and they had somebody else from here doing it. So I wasn't the only one. It was two of us going. And so this is awkward, because now, like, okay, you owe me a no-show, but you just paid me to come. You're like, do I wash that out? Like, how do I handle this? Well, they ended up no-showing right after that. And so with that one, I went, I'm done. And I was able to email and say, just based on, this situation and this no-show that occurred and, this other situation of not coming, I think it's best that we terminate our relationship immediately. And they came back with a response of, based on the facts you have given, so no responsibility, but based on the facts you've given, I agree, or something to that effect. Okay, like, great, so we can move on. Well, why I say it was totally unethical is that I didn't fully understand that even if you have the two supervisors, like, you still have to meet with both of them every week. It's not, well, if I'm out of town, my cohort here can do it for me. It doesn't work like that. So I was able to wash my hands of it because there was someone else that I knew was in the wing and already being used, that was already on file with the board. Had they not been, I would have, had to, send the email and state, I feel like it's best, that you start looking for a new supervisor. The board requires that we continue supervision weekly, for you to be able to count your hours. If we do not follow through with supervision on a weekly basis, I will not be willing to sign off, on the hours that they have gained while they were under my name. And so you give them usually it has to be 60 days based on the board now, because it takes 30 days to find a new supervisor, hopefully, as they're trying to find someone, maybe a little less. And it takes the board a month to be able to swap the supervision over on the website. So if you give them that 60-day, you're giving them the notice, you're letting them know you're still going to have to be meeting, and that may be really uncomfortable. But yes, can you get out of it? Yes. If that person did not respond and they chose not to come back, what I would do is after, that first no-show, and maybe they, they're no-showing, because usually it's same day, same time kind of thing. If they don't show up that second week and you have not heard any response from them, then I would immediately send a letter to the board. You fax it over to them, or you can scan it and email it to them, and it just says, as of this date, this person is no longer under my supervision. I wouldn't go into a huge amount of detail, because you don't want to create intern fury towards you,
Sure.
which could create there's always complaints and lawsuits and things that can happen. So you're just trying to say, like, effective this date. And I would send a copy to the intern and send a copy, to the board, and it's up to them, to deal with it at that point. But that's what I would do if it was me. So if that helps answer how to navigate it. Okay. The ethics and supervision, the responsibilities that we have are to make sure paperwork's done correctly, that we're staying up to date with the board rules, that we are looking at their social media, and that we've discussed that with them, which they need to consider. A lot of them probably haven't considered. A client could look them up and see anything they have plastered all over the place. What to charge for an intern, being able to know what you're going to charge, considering that payment along with your future business plans. Don't take someone on for free, kind of like we were talking about earlier, if you're not wanting to continue to do it for free for the rest of duration of however long your supervision contract. Because what they're going to do is tell a friend and say, hey, this person does it for free, head that direction, or they do this for me. If you said, I'm going to do this just for you, so don't advertise it to other people, then you've covered yourself. But you just need to recognize, what do I want this to look like? We're viewing it as a long-term committed relationship. It may not be, but you view it that way just in case, because it could be. The other one is think about the software and records, like treatment planning. What are you going to utilize, and how are you going to handle that with an intern? And do you have access to anything that they're doing, and what you want to do about that? And the other one's looking on the board website for the current forms. So it's up to us to keep up with that type of information. For new supervisees, they begin supervision when their intern license is posted, and they end it when they have received full licensure. So after they finish their hours, they continue in supervision until they have become fully licensed. With new supervisees, you do the supervisory agreement form, and that means they're new to the field, they're just graduating. If it's anyone who has been already getting experience hours, then you're just using that supervisor site change request form, and that can be emailed to the board. So you can send things through email as well as, mailing it in. If you ever mail, make sure you do that certified signature return receipt. That's the only way you mail anything to the board, is making sure that you send it in that way, so that you've got confirmation that they received it. We all know kind of the situation, we were already talking about it, between people working for multiple boards and not knowing all the situation. We know of numerous paperwork. I know of a lot of paperwork things that have happened around here, or things have been lost, or things, or it's unknown where they end up, or whatever might happen. So it's up to us to make sure we've done our part. The paperwork for the supervisees, this is what we make sure that we have put into place. So there's the informed consent, and that's for the supervisee. And then I gave you the couple of examples, and you'll have the electronic document. So if you did not receive one in your previous training, you could be able to change, take out my information and put in your information, but you could use this informed consent, and you'll have the electronic document for that. The contracts are the next piece, and you want to make sure that you're doing an informed consent and a contract with every supervisee you have, even if they're going to be an employee and you have an employment, contract that they sign. This is part of supervision, and that's part of employment. And doing it this way was the hugest benefit when I had that person I had to let go. Not only did I have these things in place, but at that point in time, because of some circumstances, we had started charging for supervision. So supervision is separate from your employment. You will pay every week, just like a client does when you come in for supervision. You know, the check and what you receive from us for the hours that you serve will be totally separate. They're completely separate. So that really helped in that situation because it kept it from being like shaming or demeaning, like now I have to start paying her, or now I'm, you know, it's different. I'm not an employee. So we just continued the same thing we'd been doing, and that was really helpful in that situation. So it's something to consider if you, you know, are not wanting it to be free as a part of employment. I gave you the LPC supervision contract, and then you've also got the LMFT one because they are a little bit different and the rules are a little bit different. So make sure that you're using the right one. So that's informed consent and contract. So to this point, informed consent may have meant that's something we do with the client. We get consent for them to do counseling. Well, now you're getting it from supervision. And what happens is I don't get a lot of opportunities in that first time that I meet with them to actually talk about myself because I'm just wanting to find out about their experiences and what they've experienced to that point, but also, you know, any concerns that I should have and, you know, what types of supervision they've been under. So I don't really talk about myself a whole lot in that time. So this lets them see here are the forms that we would use for supervision. Feel free to look through these, then they'll know a little bit more about my background. Not that they couldn't find it on the website or somewhere else, but it would let them know even more. So then we get to, there's two other types. So we'll end up, informed consent will mean a lot of things. It means one we have with the client, one we have with the supervisee, and then there's the one that the supervisee has with the client that is different. So informed consent for clients is where they tell the status that they're a supervisee, and then they have your name on it attached. So it tells who their supervisor is so that they could contact you if they wanted to, which is what the board requires. And then there's the just normal informed consent we're used to, where that's confidentiality and treatment and procedures. So I gave you a copy of a sample release form for video and electronic media. If you wanted to use video, you saw on my informed consent it said video, case consultation, you know, group. It had some options, and depending on whether they're, you know, on-site supervisees, off-site supervisees, I might use a lot of different things. So you do have that because that would be another added piece. If you wanted video, they have to get that release as well. And the next page is where I have the LPC intern, just that counseling agreement. So any questions on any of this or how to use it or why? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate the forms.
Okay, good. So there you go. So hopefully, yes, there'll be some things that'll make it a little easier for you, and that's part of why we do the electronic side now with this as a mandatory piece, just because I want to know if someone's coming through and they're saying, just like, you know, I can say I've been to trainings and what I got and didn't got. If they come through, I want to know they had the tools versus they could choose to get them or they could choose not to. So at least you'll have everything by the end of today that you might need. The LPC supervision beginning checklist I've given you, there is one that's on the board website. And if your training did not have you going onto the board website and looking at all these things, please go on by the end of today and make sure that you're very aware of where all the tools are and what you could be using. Their supervision beginning checklist looks very different than this one. What happened with the checklist and even the site supervisor change request form and some of these added tools is that the board was getting so many different, we'll say, complaints or supervisors having to go for paperwork or different things that TCA and some people from there ended up trying to help and say, well, why don't we put some more tools out there to hopefully prevent things like this from happening? And that's where the supervision beginning checklist came from. And so what I did is I've used it, but then I've added on my requirements that I have when I'm looking for someone. So this one would go a little bit further to help you to make sure you're following the steps that we've talked about today. So there's the 3 email addresses, the informed consent, the contract, the supervisory agreement form, or the site change request form, depending on which one's applicable. Remember, you always have to have the copy of your license, your little card, your renewal card, has to be sent in with any of that paperwork. If you ever forget, they will not approve it, and then it just slows that intern process down even more of getting it added on. So you always want to remember that. You're trying to match the liability insurance. If you're becoming a group, then you want to consider that group liability. Make copies of everything. Mail everything, certified mail, signature, return receipt. Look at the website and look at the online confirmation so you know when that happens, and then the confirmation of the supervisory side. So a big bulk of those are not on the one that's on their website. So this is just something I've adapted. So I like you to know that. For continuing in supervision, the copies of the logs, clarifying for them what counts as direct and indirect hours, noting on that content section of the log, putting notes on it every week, and do not put case consultation every week. It has to have specifics. What were you talking about? What type of client issue? Remember to give receipts, because they'll need those for tax purposes. Anytime you talk about ethics or board rules, you have to put that in that content section. If they get the log and something has happened and they're looking at it and they're like, well, you've never even talked about the rules. They don't even know what they are. You've got to be able to back it up. It's like documentation with a client. And so you need to show that you were doing due diligence to make that happen. There's the copies of the site change form if you ever need to be doing that, as they add sites, delete sites. There's the address changes, and that's notifying them within 30 days if that ever happens. And then remediation plans, making sure that you're keeping those on file if you need them. Every 6 months, trying to keep up with watching the websites, seeing who's listed under you, but also watching their advertising to see how they're advertising themselves. That's when you look at the evaluations. And then when you end is the supervisory experience documentation form, and that's whether they find out whether they're licensed or not. Once they're removed from me and they are fully licensed, then that's when we stop supervision. And several of these things, you really have to make sure that they do remove that person from being under your name. I've had someone that stayed there for like 2 years, and it said they were fully licensed, but they were still listed under me. And I kept faxing, like saying, please get this person off. And so they finally did. So that's why you have to keep watching the website. Is don't just trust that things have happened. Like, you have to keep up with it. When it comes to the direct and indirect hours, my perspective on that had to change drastically from what my perception was, because all of my hours, I started in the field, I had several jobs, and I just got them one client at a time, 1 hour at a time, and I was clicking away at my hours. And since then, I've had many supervisees where I had to reconsider, okay, what is the client hour and what does that look like? So examples of that would be that I had someone who was working at an agency nearby, and they were doing trainings in hospitals and with professionals like nurses and people like that on the topics of adoption. And so these presentations were to help them know how to better work with a birth mom who might come through their facility, after placing a child for adoption. So I was, trying to think through. That was not exactly obviously what I had in mind when I first started. And the rules obviously are not real clear. I mean, it has here all the types of counseling that you can do, and here's what indirect hours are, but it gets gray, and everybody will have a different opinion. I find that a lot on this issue too. So for me, it was on a counseling topic. It was with a group. It was informing them, giving them information, training them. A lot of what we would do in a counseling session, if we were one-on-one and someone's wanting more information about adoption or considering options or whatever that might be. So we did end up counting those hours, like those were direct hours, even though it wasn't necessarily, I have a client on my schedule at 9, I show up at work, they come in my office, we sign all the forms. It didn't look like that at all. I have another one who's a pastor, and you can imagine what that looks like. And so when you're a pastor, people are grabbing you in the hall all the time. It's not scheduled. This person does specifically, that is part of their job responsibility, and they have set hours during their week where they have scheduled clients. So it looks like here, but it's in a church setting. And And so in the midst of that, there's also this, I was kind of amazed by the statistics, in that they ended up finding out, once they were really looking into things, that 80% of the people coming through for that counseling are not faith-based and are not members of that church. So it's like an outreach completely to the community. And these people don't even want faith-based counseling, but it's free. So they're going. So with that, we had this side of, okay, there are appointments that are scheduled, but then there's, hey, so-and-so grabbed me in the hall. We talked for 20 minutes. This is going on at home. Or there's, hey, so-and-so passed away. I headed to their house tonight. I met with the family for 2 hours. They're not necessarily planning the service, they're just being with them. That is counseling, to me. So I really had to broaden my perspective on things that could count, just like school counseling, teachers maybe grabbing them in the hall to chit chat about a difficult student or, some help that they need. Well, that's, counting. They're leading groups on drugs and alcohol and all kinds of bullying and social skills and all kinds of other things. But there's a lot of these other elements that really are that one-on-one and trying to help them along the way. But there's no paperwork. My pastor isn't like, well, fill this out and I can talk to you for 10 minutes. That doesn't happen. So I really had to change. There's not necessarily, they have to log it all on a separate log than the board log we keep, because I want their time tallied and who they spent it with, and they could back that up. Not that the board cares, but I care. And so I want to know that. But it does look very different because there's no session note, on some of this stuff. So do you have questions about that or any other hours or how they count? Or someone came through and they're on a hospital unit. It's in Dallas, and one supervisor was saying they would not allow, I don't remember specifically at this point what it was. I want to say an assessment of some type of early on assessment they were doing to count. And they were asking me, would you let that count? And I said, from my perspective, that is something that I would let count. If you chose to let your supervisee count that, I think you just need to be really clear. You need to understand that every supervisor has different perspectives, and sometimes the rules have some gray. This is something that I really feel like is a direct hour, but it will not be helpful to you to be advertising that to other people on this unit, or that you are counting those hours. So it goes back, there's ethics, but then there's everyone is passionate about something different and can be very opinionated on different things. So from my viewpoint, what she was describing, whatever it was, I felt like it definitely was valid. But to another supervisor, they were pretty clear.
I think it also gets complicated when people are intertwined with LCSW, because theirs is super prescriptive.
Mm-hmm. Every state and every license has different things. I know in Oklahoma, they have one right now with the LPC. If you don't earn at least 20 hours that week, you can't count any of them. Oh so to me, it doesn't make a lot of...
I've never gotten a license.
I know. It kind of doesn't make sense. So with social worker, theirs is even more strict than any of our stuff, in that they have to turn in their job responsibilities, and it all has to be approved before that site can be allowed. Whereas we just kind of send it in with an address and sure, go for it. Yes.
Process.
So there is. So they're a little more strict on the front end, and maybe, it's a little
But they
looser.
take it all the way up to LMSW with a lot less hoops.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's interesting.
It is interesting. And when people ask, why are there all these idiosyncrasies between the board and this one's 24, continuing on, this one's 30, this one's 6, this one's 3, this one's 2 Texas ethics, this one's, 6. It's because it made a lot of sense once it got explained to me, but the boards have to differentiate themselves enough that the government will recognize us as having different titles. If we all had the same requirements, they would just slap us all into that same group. Well, you can all be psychologists. I'm not just using that as an example, that we just all be in this entity of a mental health professional, and there's no distinction. And so they have to create it to be varied enough, so that it can be recognized differently. But it does create struggles. It's why can't we just be the same requirements? Yes, we're different, and we know we're different, but can we not have some similarities, across also? What I've moved to right now, and because I have, several at this point, we're doing group every other week. there was a point that I only had a few, and I was going ahead and seeing them. They were coupled together. I had 2 sets, so I guess there were 4, and I'd have 2 and 2, and they were always together every week. So I mean, it was still individual board's eyes, group my eyes, and that led to some situations that I don't want to repeat. I thought some things were being followed through on. It's a long story, but there was like some crime victims paperwork that came through. I realized, another set came through, like we're closing this case, and I realized I'd never seen the other set completed and thought, well, I gave that to the intern. It was in supervision. I told them to fill it out. Did they turn it in and not give it to me? Like, what happened? And I ended up finding out it was being carried around in a bag, just a bag, that was going to their other job, and for quite a while. And so that was scary. That's HIPAA, but it's also just, negligence on following through with your job that you're working at. That was when I said that I had several that were full-time other places and worked with us part-time, and it did not work. And I said I wouldn't do it again because it was very hard for them to be a part of the culture when they were here at night, when our main staff is not here. It was very hard for me to keep tabs on what was going on because they're here when I'm not always here. And they have job responsibilities somewhere else. And this is not like an easy, hey, I'll just hang out for 4 hours. Let me see 4 people. Like, there's termination plans. We require you call your clients. You have to do your notes. There's all kinds of things that go into play that have to be accomplished and completed, different than maybe an agency. I don't know, someone else might let them do. And so we just realized, I was like, I'm not going to touch this for a while. I'll get burnt, and then I back off, and then I'll try something else. So it's just hard. It's hard, So in that situation, I just realized, okay, they did make the right choice. I just ended up having to sit them down and say, I really need you to think through if you can handle, this position along with what you're doing. And they did come back there. Of course, their job had changed in the meantime since they had signed on, as we keep talking about. They don't really know what they're going to be doing forever. And so in the midst of that, it had more responsibilities, and the answer came back was like, yes, I need to phase out, which was the right choice, so that was good. But yes, there are lots of dynamics, that can go into anything. The reference checks are really helpful too. There was one I had one time. It was probably my worst interview up until this last one. And that one was way in the beginning, and I was so glad I had just started doing the reference checks. But they had come in, and a good indicator, like, go with your gut, is what I always say. If you can do that, do it. They had come in, and we had met, and it was really complicated. They were in a suburb of here. They were wanting to drive in, which that should already kind of be a red flag. Like, why do you need to drive to see me? There's other people available. Then there was, they were promoting themselves as a parent facilitator, I guess is what we would say. Kind of parent coordination facilitator with the court. And in a suburb, they can do that because the court can appoint anyone. They don't have to have education requirements. All those requirements that are in our board rules of what someone has to have done, they hadn't done. But they had a website that promoted it. And what it said on it was like certified, a CART. So it had like parent, I think facilitation is what it said, CART. Well, a certified anger resolution therapist is a 6-hour training, and you call yourself a CART, but they had no licensure whatsoever. And so I'm meeting, and I'm just racking my brain, trying to figure out the puzzle pieces. And so I said, you're going to have to take that website down. You've got to quit promoting yourself as a CART if you're going to be under some type of licensure, like an intern or associate. And you need to quit doing this parent facilitation, things on the side. And so, okay, I'll do that. Well, as they were leaving, they were like, well, don't I owe you for today? And I was like, oh, no, like, today's free. You don't want to take money that first time because they're wanting, like, she committed to me. I paid her. Like, she's with me now. So you don't want to commit until you've gotten, like, reference checks and everything. Even if they're offering, just don't do it. So I was so glad I didn't. And so I was like, no, today's free. So it ended up getting more complicated. I spent way too much time on this person, but they were wanting to do their hours in their wife's practice where they were doing office work for her currently. But then there's the rule about you can't own a practice. practice. And so that got a little complicated, because to me, like, if you went to court, you owned half of it. You know, that's, if you got divorced, it's a little complicated. So then I like threw that in the mix. Well, then the references came back, and they were both references that were just references for his wife. Neither of them knew him, and it was very obvious. And, you know, one of them did not have positive things to say. So I think I got 3 back even. And I was like, oh, this is not going well. It even happened to be a board member at the time. And I was like, oh, I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole now. But then I found out they had created it to where they could do hours in the office of one of those references. So, okay, you won't let me leave my wife's practice, I'll just go over here. And I already knew he's just going to leave space. Like, he's going to leave space. It doesn't matter what I say or what I know, you know, or they'll have some kind of agreement, you know, but like no one's watching over him. He's still just out there, you know, doing whatever hours. I'm never going to know. There's no one in the facility. It's a practice. And so I ended up, you know, completely just backing away from that one. And there was some frustration. And I, you know, probably I went in that situation what the references had said, and obviously were not willing to say to him. I felt like maybe it was my responsibility to share some of that. Like, when I choose a supervisee, I want someone who's, you know, who is above and beyond what the ethics and what the law say, not someone I'm having to catch and then we're having to backtrack and, okay, do it this way, and okay, catch this, you know, backtrack. And then I said some things that have been stated by them that I had noticed some characteristics of. So it was not positive, you know, the response that I got, but I felt like that was, you know, part of my responsibility. I had already spent enough time on that situation. And so that was another one that I had where if there's things about it that are fuzzy. I had someone wanting to drive from Dallas one time, and I was like, this is just weird. And we met, and they interviewed me for an hour. Like, I hardly got any questions in. I didn't feel like I knew them at all. And so they were really, you know, were asking for supervision through email. And I was like, no, I'm really too busy. I've got too many people. So then, like 3 months later, approached me again. Will you please consider, you know, me for supervision? And I'm just thinking, maybe I had a bad day. Like, maybe it was me. Maybe, like, I'm reading this whole thing wrong. Maybe it's my fault. I don't know, you know. And so I meet with them again. And what it was is I would ask questions, and it's like the answer that was given was like this much surface depth. And there should have been a whole lot more, like, you know, if there's a 20-year gap where you weren't working and then all of a sudden you were managing people in construction, like, you know, what happened with that? It was one answer, you know, one sentence. And so it just, like, there was no, like, honesty. And part of it was after I met with her that first time, the next day she sent me all these questions. You said this, and this. Tell me more about that. Well, I met that second time. I really seriously considered taking her on. Like, I feel sorry for her. Maybe I should take her. The next day, guess what happened? You said this. And I was like, oh, I can't do this for 2 years. This is not going to go well. So, like, if you can, you know, trust yourself enough to know just your judgment. If there's any kind of red flag, don't take it as like, oh, I'm so great, they're willing to drive. Take it as, why are they passing all these people all the way to get to me? You know, like, think about the dynamics of what else may be, you know, in the mix, and that should help protect you in the long run. So there's no foolproof way. I wish I could tell you, like, I choose the absolute, always the best supervisees. I've told about some of mine where they're difficult sometimes, but it's not ethical situations. It's just how far are they going to progress in supervision, you know, and how much insight they have and how much of their own stuff they've dealt with. So we're headed into some releases and the logs and some other things. The on-site supervisor release, acknowledgement of responsibilities. This one's brand new, that I created just based on what I felt like would be helpful. I have not been able to implement it yet, so I'll let you all be my feedback people, as I've told all the people in the trainings recently on how well it works. But what I've seen is this black hole that exists between these people that I have who are off-site and then me over here supervising them, and I never really see what they're doing. I don't even know the people, you know, always over them. Like, personally, haven't spoken with them. I may know who their supervisor is. And so what I'm trying to do is secure, you know, just information, making sure it gets crossed back and forth, and also being able to try to set up some boundaries and barriers just in case something was ever going on that shouldn't be. At the top of that is the student information, or it could be interns, so whichever way that goes. And then there's the clinical hours site information where they would fill in where they're at. And then and I have them put the web address so I can check the website, because a lot of agencies don't put the right credentials. It says LPCI, it says this, it says that. It says all kinds of things. And there's also a complaint that just went before the board that I know of an agency. They had, like, interns were doing all the clinical hours, and they had their licensed professionals doing a lot of the administrative things, but they didn't have their credentials because they were doing administrative. Like, to me, that makes sense. Like, they're not practicing. Well, another agency nearby felt threatened by what they were coming into the area starting to do and filed a complaint against them for not having their credentials listed, even though that's not what they necessarily do, in their current job position. And so there was a complaint, and they had to spend all that time going before the board and trying to send in the things to back it up and all this type of stuff. So you do want to make sure, whereas in the past I would have said, well, if it's a school person and they choose not to use the credential, then they wouldn't list the supervisor. But now I'm just at a point, after hearing all these kinds of things that go on, just list it always, have my name after it, those types of things. So there's the clinical hours site information, the site supervisor information, so who is at their site, who really supervises them for their job. And then there's my information, and I'm asking them to attach a copy of their job responsibilities. So somewhat like the social worker side of, like, what are they doing in their job? So I know about how many hours should they be getting a week, because I don't know where they're at. And there's how do they receive supervision, what accountability do they have, and then asking them to sign the bottom of the job responsibilities, their supervisor on site, to make sure that they agree, yes, this is what they're doing. The release is on the next page, and they're releasing and consenting for me to contact their site supervisor at any time. And then the supervisee signs it, and then I have them circle, like, is videotape allowed or not allowed? Are they allowed to bring their clinical notes and treatment plans to supervision sessions, or are they not? Like, a supervisee could tell me, well, I'm not allowed to bring it back. I don't know. I'm just going on what they tell me. I don't know whether that's true or not. And then I have, like, please contact me if any of those things pop up where there are concerns of being ethical, on the job, being on time, being open to feedback, being a team player, accurate documentation, and completing job responsibilities. So any of those things, like, please contact me, basically, where I can at least show that I attempted to protect myself, and to protect them if possible. The next one is the form that I have supervisees do on a weekly basis. So this is not a board form. This is not anything they require. It's just one that I came up with. What I like about it is it makes them think before they come, and it makes my job easier because they have to fill in what are their goals for that day. Like, what do they need help with? What are the questions? They have to write down risk management concerns. So is there any suicidal risk? Is there any homicidal risk? They're like, is there anything we need to be concerned about? I added on there after the ones that I told you I got burned by, where we found out the paperwork was being in the bag. Then I found out notes were a little bit behind and other things were a little bit behind. So it says, like, have you done all your notes? Have you done your treatment plans? Have you called the people you should have called in last month? And have you done termination forms, like to close out, files, whatever you need to be doing? Do all of your emails, and all web advertising, does it have my name listed with the right credentials? And so I got burned and I added it all. So it's all there. It's up to you if you want to use it. I put homework I was given and have completed, or resources I've read or looked into. This is how I knew what that intern was doing every week. She was writing down all these things she was doing that were not things I told her to do. So I wasn't going to give her more because she had way more on her plate than she even needed to have at that point. The strengths in the counseling sessions, and then what they need to improve on in the counseling sessions since I've seen them. And the back, the reason that I have things listed there with the total number of hours and then the client seen and actions taken. The logs are fine, and they do tally week by week. And at the end of a page, they tally the page. What I want, though, on a weekly basis that I have them is I just want to know, how far are we? Like, where are we at in this process? I don't, your page is there. Okay, there's 10 weeks worth, but I want the overall, just bottom line. So they put the total number of direct hours they have and indirect, and this is what I keep every week. So if they did happen to lose a log, we could backtrack. It'd be a little harder without the log, but we could backtrack using these forms to try to figure out what they had each week and where they were at. For clients seen and actions taken, I don't have them write out like a paragraph for every client. If you're at an agency seeing 60 people, you probably just need an Excel sheet is what it comes down to. But for mine, most of them can write like initials or just first name, and then they write the issue that they're coming in for, or maybe the issue they dealt with that week. So like infidelity or play therapy, divorce, or adolescent, suicidal thought, whatever it was, they can just put it, and it just helps me tag, because I'm supposed to know everyone they're seeing, and we're never going to talk about everyone they're seeing, even if they're only seeing a handful of people. So that's the way I keep up. The logs will be on the flash drive too, and they include the new requirements as of the last set of board rules that came out from July. And so that one has the week, and then they're supposed to mark whether it was individual or group. They're supposed to mark if it was face-to-face or web, and then if it's individual counseling, if it was phone or web counseling, and then the indirect hours. And then they put the cumulative. Cumulative is just for that week. And then at the bottom of it, they can tally it at the bottom. There's the content, and then you sign it. So this is not the same one that's on the board website. Again, I added in and changed it based on the new rules, and they're not going to adapt and change theirs because it came from someone else who was helping them out by giving it to them. So those are just there as tools. They don't look at it as official forms. The leave of absence supervision contract, one of the newer things that occurred with the newest set of rules that came out is that they ended up saying that we needed to be doing leave of absence and remediation plans, and we've never had anything like this before. I will say it is scary to me, and so for a number of reasons that I have my own concerns about. One of them is the leave of absence does not dictate what the leave of absence would be for. It's supposed to be if it's for a month or more, but it doesn't say like medical illness, pregnancy leave. It doesn't, give any qualifications whatsoever. So I could see some supervisee and supervisor are like, hey, I'm moving. Can I be off for a month or something going on? Sure. And so they don't meet. And then they're coming back together. But what it doesn't differentiate is it doesn't say that you can't get client hours while you're on leave. And I have a definite problem myself with someone continuing to count hours and not coming into supervision but being on leave of absence. That's what you would think it would mean. Like when we talk about leave of absence from a job, you're not working anymore. But it's not spelled out. And as we know, we already have been talking about our profession and how lots of people do all kinds of things that we really don't understand. It makes sense to them, but it doesn't make sense to us. It just seems inappropriate, and that would be one that I could see some ramifications coming from. So I've created it. The way I made it in the termination, I tried to make it super clear. But I just said, if the supervisee does not confirm their return and return to supervision by the agreed upon time frame, it's at the supervisor's discretion whether or not they would like to extend the leave of absence or terminate the supervisor relationship. If the supervisor chooses to terminate, the supervisor will give 30 days to obtain a new supervisor, and the supervisee shall be entitled to a copy of the records kept by the supervisor for services rendered up to the effective date of such termination. So for me, I'm having them put when they're returning. And if they don't return and I don't hear from them, then I'm going to follow up. And if I don't hear anything, then we're following through with this. You've got 30 days. I haven't heard from you. You're not back. So I understand, there are reasons. There's cancer. There is pregnancy leave. There are things. But I'm even very, a pregnancy leave, yes, work gives you 3 months, but I'm even very leery on anything close to being that long. So, if there's 3, to 4 weeks, like that could be a possibility. But even if you're bringing your child with you, into supervision, for us to start making sure that we're still meeting and you're getting your time in. Because what you don't want is to end up before the board, and I've seen it happen with people who were in chemo, radiation, whatever. If they were diligent and they were doing it over the phone and they were trying, yes, they take that into consideration and they're paying attention. But if there are just these huge gaps and it's never made up, that's part of why I'm sure they came up with the leave of absence, but it has a lot of gray that comes with it too. So I say that, and that it's up to you how you choose to use it, but I would use it very sparingly. It's not something, and it has to be a month or more. So it's not just, well, I'm going to throw this out. They're going to be on a mission trip for 3 weeks, and let's do this leave of absence, and it'll cover that. If they were going to do that, you could end up, making up the hours, or you could choose to let one slide, make up the other 2. It's not that they're looking for every single week, and they're not going to pinpoint, but they want to see consistency, and they want to know that you've tried. So, everyone goes on vacation, everyone has illness, things happen, and there's grace, and there's also the black and white of, there are months that have 5 weeks in them, and you've met 5 times, not 4, and it says an average of 4, and okay, maybe that could carry over and count as 1 when you missed 1. So there are all these, situations that could come into play, but just consider that with the leave of absence. Don't just throw it out to anyone. The remediation plan I gave you, I tried to give some examples of reasons that you would put them on a remediation plan. My experience as an employer, when I have to do a remediation plan, usually they end up finding another place of employment because they know things are not headed in a great direction. I haven't had to do it with a supervisee yet. And so I don't know, I don't have a story yet of what that situation will be like. I'm sure that I will get an opportunity at some point I could share with you on what will happen. But hopefully you won't have to use that one too much either. But the board is wanting to know if you're going to fill out the experience documentation form and you're going to mark and say, I have concerns about this person being in the field. They're going to want to know you better have some backup, to show. I have talked to them about this. We have worked on it. I have given them other things to do to try to help them with it. You don't just mark that, like, that's just my opinion, and just say, I just think that this person shouldn't be allowed in the field. That's their career. They've spent all of their schooling and all of this time, trying to work towards that. So you want to be careful. Along those lines, I forgot to say that with the experience documentation form, there's this mythical thinking of we only use that when someone is completely done with their hours. So they finish their hours, we fill out experience documentation form, we mail it off, and they get fully licensed. It's not. Anytime you're inheriting someone, they need to have done that form with their last supervisor. Anytime you are finishing with someone, I don't care if they've done 10 hours or 1,000 hours, you have to fill out the experience documentation form. It is not another supervisor's responsibility to sign off on hours that they did not oversee, and it's not your responsibility to sign off on someone else's hours that you did not oversee. You want to be very careful about that and what you take responsibility for. So I know that is a really confusing piece because it's like saying, what's your total number of hours? And it acts like you're reaching licensure. But just know when you're filling that out, you can fill it out and send it into the board, and they may not finish their hours for 2 more years, but hopefully the board has kept it. If not, they should have kept it, and you should have kept it, so you've got copies of it everywhere, and that way you've got some backup to show, yes, they did their hours here, I turned this in, here's the date, here's when we filled it out, that type of thing. So just do that signature return receipt, or make sure you email it with getting the confirmation and keep copies. Any questions?
If you're going to give someone the 60-day termination thing, things aren't working out, does the board want to see a remediation plan before you did that, or not necessarily? Like if you're going to fire someone, usually they want you to have documentation that you tried to, but is that the same with this or not?
I don't think it is. I mean, if they were pushing back, maybe refusing to find another supervisor, okay. I guess, it could be something to have in place, just to say, like, here are the concerns I've got. Not only are you refusing to find someone, but you also, like, here are the concerns that I have from us working. The hope would be in a supervision relationship that whether it's kind of like a client, whether you're letting them know, I just don't have the time to put into this that I thought that I would, and I know you deserve more. It's kind of like we phrase it really positive, but maybe it's certainly we just realized this is too much work having you. However you want to phrase it, you could phrase it, and just trying to let them know. So if you have to make the decision, this is more, you know, I am concerned about that ending point, and I'm not telling them the whole time.
Right.
And then maybe we end up before the board because some paperwork went wrong, and then I'm like throwing them under the bus, and and then, you know, they are saying, well, they had no clue. So it just, and then it just keeps going. So
That makes sense. Thank you.
yes, sure. So those would be examples of when I would try for it. The structure of supervision we've talked about. Here's what you can do. You start out, you find out their goals for the session, you find out their strengths and weaknesses, which you already noticed were on the form that I gave you that you could use every week. There are some questions when they're talking about new clients. What's their diagnosis, the 6-stage model? Is there a difference between the client goals and, you know, your goals that you see for them? Are there multicultural issues? Are there any personal issues? Are there any ethical issues? So you could, anytime they bring up a new client, you could be asking some of those. You're going to have some teaching component or resource, hopefully you're giving them. And then at the end, you could ask them, you know, about the benefit that day, what they're walking away with, what they need to implement. And then say, is there anything I've not addressed, you know, that we need to? So you could do a couple of those things to help out. I will say, not every time am I asking what was the benefit today and what has not been addressed, you know, or what was unhelpful. But it would help at the end. It gives a recap and lets you know if you all are on track. The dyad is the 2 being in supervision, but it's counted as individual. And then there's the group. So those are 3 different structures you could have. Just remember the group is the 50%. Evaluation and supervision, I really recommend. It's kind of like the one I told you about that was a little awkward. I did that at the 3-month point, and that's what I usually recommend when you first start with someone. Then after that, you can move it back and do it at the 6-month point. There's formative feedback, which is every single week I'm meeting with them and I'm giving them, you know, you could also use, I gave you the self-awareness evaluation, the play therapist, and motivation for change, the reminder card. You could use any of those, and that's considered formative feedback. A summative assessment is the more specific, where it's every 6 months and I'm handing you an evaluation that you're completing, and so we're using that. The details of evaluation, you're trying to make sure that you're looking at progress, that you've told them the frequency to expect, that they know about remediation plans and what to expect, and decide if you're both going to be doing evaluations. I've given you some to where you would trade. You fill out one and they fill out one on you at the same time. So it's not just like I'm always evaluating you. It goes both directions. And so the ones, I'm trying to think, I think I've gone through most of that. The SPAI is the first one. And like a lot of things within this manual, I've told you I would use this, but I would adapt it. I would use this, but I would adapt it. This is one of those. What happened is I gave it to a supervisee I have. She was one of those that said, teach me everything I didn't learn when I was in school. She had been out of school for several years, worked for CPS. She's still with me as a supervisee. I really enjoy working with her. She is teachable. She gets just a few hours every week. I mean, we're just like pushing through here to the bitter end. I have a lot of those. And so you're just trying to get to that point. And what happened is I gave her the SPAI, and it says A through G, and you can mark any of them. Well, A through F is on the front page, and then look what G says. I would like additional information and training on this skill. And guess what happened? So it was G on everything. So this is like 4 pages long, and a lot of it said G. If you didn't notice yet, it's based on Bernard and Goodyear's model. It has intervention skills, then it has conceptualization skills, and then it has personalization, and then they threw in the professional behavior. So it's based on it. So if you knew I'm a Bernard and Goodyear person, this is the model I'm using for supervision. I'm telling my supervisees, they're going to know the role I'm using. They're going to know, where things stand. Then you could use this. How I would recommend using it at this point, and what I've started doing is, and we ended up backtracking. We had a firm conversation about, the additional training and information didn't come necessarily from me. That meant having to do some on the outside too and take responsibility for it. And I don't think that was their intention, but I felt pressure immediately when I was seeing all of this. So you could give and say, okay, I want you to look at the intervention skills, and I want you to mark, you can only use A through F, and I want you to mark, for each of those, so that I know which ones you're feeling pretty good about and which ones you're not feeling as competent on, and let's work on that piece first. So a lot of these can be broken up, and you can break them up and do it over several sessions, or you could do one, for that 6-month time frame. It's up to you how you want to implement it. But that is my disclaimer with the SBAI. So I do think it's useful. I still use it. I just use it differently than I used it before. There's the summative evaluation rating scale for the supervisor. This one, it is a little more school focused, or you'd have to have a little bit more information, because it's saying, there's the multicultural and DSM. Yes, those things are there. But then it says applying intervention strategies. You would hope you'd know some, and you'd hope you know about rapport, but it's hard to know some of that information. So it could be a good one. It just depends on your setting and how much information you have. The formative evaluation of counselor behaviors, that one's, it says long form. And some of these they went over on the page, and I apologize for that. So on your electronic flash drive, they're not like that. They'll be fine. So I just got a little off kilter, but you could use that one too, and it's the 1 through 7. It's a Likert scale. The summative supervision evaluation rating scale for the supervisee, that's one that I created. I like it. It's just saying, from their viewpoint. So it said, when it says for supervising, it means they're filling it out on me, like it's theirs to fill out. So is attentive to supervisees' needs and goals, gives suggestions to apply in counseling sessions, gives full attention to supervising and supervision. This may have been the one that I used, that I had been describing, and the marks were a little bit lower than what I thought they might be, and then there wasn't the backup for it. So I did like it. It made it effective to talk about, and that was the goal of having the evaluation. The one that says for supervisor was the one that I completed for them. And so that one has brings personal style, is open and honest, doesn't let personal issues affect client care, builds a therapeutic alliance. So most of those things I can know, even if it's an offsite supervisee, which many of mine are right now. So that could help you out. There's also, the next page has the summative supervision styles index form. This one's for the supervisor. And so for this one, I would be completing this one. It's more on myself. So during live supervision, I'm in charge of the session, or I develop the final intervention to be used in a session. So I'm just rating myself. It's me evaluating, what am I doing? Hopefully I have some insight as to what I'm doing in supervision. And then there's the supervision styles index for a supervisee. And so they would fill that one out for me. And so there are several there. So those are all of the evaluations that you would have the option when you get to that point of 3 months or 6 months that you would like to use. The anticipatory supervisee anxiety scale is one. That one is good for someone who is really insecure as they're getting started out, because it's saying, in anticipation of my upcoming supervision session, I feel self-conscious, feel fearful that I might receive a negative evaluation, feel annoyed with my limitations. This would have been so helpful with the one that I described that I did that evaluation with. I didn't know about this one at that point, and I wish that I had had it. So that's not an evaluation every 6 months. That's the self-care one we were looking at, and some of those others that you could use at any point in time. If you sense something's awkward or about our relationship, or we're just not at the point of relationship building that I would like for us to be at. So that's something to consider. The supervisee levels questionnaire is a 1 through 7 Likert. It also is having them, recognize themselves and their current behaviors. So I feel genuinely relaxed and comfortable. I lack self-confidence. I tend to get confused when things don't go according to plan. I feel comfortable confronting my clients. These are a lot of things that can happen in sessions, and it's good to get the information. So again, these are not evaluations for every 6 months. They're ones that they could be using at some point in time. So these are actually could be like more activities that you could use in the end. Any questions about any of these or how to use them? Okay. From here, the next one I gave you is the one I told you that I created. So it's the IDM, and it has the 8 different domains. Oh, they just had skill competence as the second one. So that's, I think to me, I felt like it was the same as intervention skills, and so I just put it under the same category. So I want to make sure I told you about it right. So there's 7 that are there that are on the Likert scale from 1 to 5. And I just came up with common events that I had in my experiences and that other people have brought up through trainings, but I'm going to let you look through that and see, is there anything else that would be helpful that you've experienced to go on that list, or any questions you have about anything on that list. Some things that I've thought about, I think another thing that's difficult is like I try to tweak all of these things along the way, but I've given it and then I've just had them pick out the ones that they wanted to talk about. It's their responsibility to bring them up. So it's not like I just talk about it in one session and we discuss every single thing.
Yeah.
I just give it to him and I've said, I want you to be able to consider where do you think you are, after a session, and you could consider that Likert scale. And then I want you to look at the things below and let me know things you have questions about. I almost am wondering if I should have them Likert scale those, like how familiar are you or how much experience have you had with this? I think that would help. They've tended, they'll bring up a few, but I think they look at it and they're like, oh, well, I know how to manage sexual attraction, but they've never really had it happen either. So they don't know what that could look like. Whereas those of us who've been in the field have had some different situations occur. So I'm reconsidering, I've given you so many tools. A lot of them I have used at some point in time, but like I've said many times, there's not a set structure for it's the same for every person. But just make some considerations on how you'd want to cover it. There are things, even the chapter 611, that's a great example of the board would say, this is why you could not have a site for 6 months and still be in supervision and still not know everything you needed to know, because we want you to know everything that has to do with the rules. 611 is just when you release records, and many of us had that mythical thinking, well, if it's not beneficial for the client, we can use that as our disclaimer for why we don't release them. And that was before I was in the know and went to a workshop where I sat with 611 and was highlighting it word for word and realized, oh, okay, like I can't necessarily use that anymore. So we've had to, redo our policies and procedures and reconsider some things. So things like that, just make sure that you're aware of what the policies are, because it's going to be hard for you to convey that information if you don't know it, yourself or haven't dealt with it. Anything else with any of this? Okay. That you can think of. The next part goes into multicultural. So it's a little bit, it's not an evaluation of every 6 months. It's not something, that has to do with theory and, or anxiety. This one's just multicultural competence, and it's having them evaluate, where they feel like they're at or where they feel like, we are at in supervision with them. So it's just an evaluation from that standpoint. So why don't we've just gone through a lot of paperwork pieces, so why don't you jot down, kind of like we did at the beginning, you jotted down 2-3 things, I need to incorporate this, or I need to be using this, or if there's some specific instruction I gave about something you want to use, I'm going to give you a second to be able to tally those down. Okay. Hopefully that will make it easier for you when you get home, just to remember what you need to get done from everything we've talked about today. I know I've thrown a lot of information in your direction. So if you tag it down, it makes it easier for you and recognize what you need to do along the way. The last piece that we'll look at is just the things that you could be doing. It's the safeguards, that could be there. So gatekeeping, it just, says a supervisee, yes. They could choose to sue, a supervisor who's not just doing due diligence that they need to, these remediation plans, these contracts, these informed consents, all these types of things. So you want to make sure you're doing everything that you can. stepwise. It says our responsibilities are limiting the number of people that we have. And like I told you before, I'm really getting to max right now where I have more than I feel like I can handle and might need to make, some decisions about one that I have that hasn't been consistent and just started. There's having a professional relationship with the supervisees and considering the impact on coworker relationships. If you're at an agency and you have been friends, which you should be with, friendly with people on staff and coworkers. As you become a supervisor, you really have to consider this is going to change the dynamics, because I may not be supervising all of the interns and some of the ones I've already known, but I may be supervising others. And what is that going to look like if I'm on a different level with some than I am with others, and the relationship that's there? So just consider what the professional relationship could look like. The ultimate responsibility to discuss clients is with us, the board would say, and addressing the code of ethics regularly. You're notifying the board anytime someone's not continuing supervision. We talked about there's not a form for that. Just write a letter and say they are no longer under my supervision. Since this date, they have not attended supervision in the last 2 weeks. Let the board handle it and go from there. There's the confidentiality when it can be broken, and making sure you've addressed that with the supervisee so they know. And just making sure, if they're off-site, like, have you seen their business cards? Have you seen the release and the informed consent that the client is saying, yes, they know they're under your supervision? And you've got all the duties of things that you can do. You've got what to teach them about assessing for harm, the likelihood of them losing a client at some point. I know I've been getting, someone's working on a dissertation right now because I keep getting these emails and they're wanting to assess, counselors who have lost a client to suicide. And so they keep sending it through, wanting to find people and get enough of a pool. And that is, it is a risk that's there, for a majority of us at some point in time. So something to help a supervisee with and help them consider. There's working with minors, and then the supervisee's responsibilities and supervision. So you could go over them, go over those with them, just being professional, taking it seriously, dual relationships, confidentiality, all the things that we've talked about. Creating remediation plans for difficult supervisees. It's the same techniques that we use with clients. There's not anything that's any different when we're trying to help with their resistance, and help our partnership that we have with them. And then the ethics and supervision, not doing it with clients, former business associates, family members, friends, any of those types of things. And there are the dangers that come with supervision. There could be too much self-disclosure or social activities being, involved in happy hour, whatever that might be. Just really consider the relationship you're trying to have with them and need to have with them. To protect yourself, that's where I said to go to the board website. It says sign up for email updates. Click on it, and then it will say Texas, board, choose the right board for you. Examiners of professional counselors or marriage and family therapists, whichever one pertains to you. You just click that one. Don't leave it blank, or you'll get ones for like every board imaginable. But you only want that one. And so they will send it to you. It goes to spam a lot, but it comes from Dishes, DSHS, and then it will let you know when they have new proposed rules, or what they're having a meeting, or when something's going on. Check your status.
Where is that?
That's on the board website. If you just go to the board website, there's a link. It says sign up for email updates, and you can do that. Checking your status, we talked about, look up on a regular basis and see who's listed under you and what sites are listed for them. And if you can at all possible, I know it's time and sacrifice, but get to a board meeting. I would highly recommend you do it when it's voluntary versus when it's not. It's a lot less stressful, and you can see what happens. In this day and time, what I've been seeing, several years ago, I would see them give out like a $500 fine for every piece of paperwork that was completed incorrectly. So someone nearby was there with 4 interns, and there were 4 pieces of paperwork that were not done correctly, and so it was $2,000 was the fine that they walked away with, just as a supervisor themselves. And so now what they're tending to do, that I've seen in the last meetings, is they're tending to have them redo the 40-hour training. So basically, you may not have had the quality that you needed to get the information that you needed at that point in time. So let's have you go back through. which I think is better. If you're going to have to pay the same amount either way, you might as well get the information you needed in the first place, than to not have it. But they can change their mind on what consequences they put out there at any point in time.